I'm Fred Bergsten, the founding director and now director emeritus and senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute. It's a great pleasure on behalf of our colleagues from the European Commission, as well as us at the Institute, to welcome all of you to this very important discussion of the future of the European Union and particularly the deepening of the economic and monetary union. Some of us here at the Institute, I underline some, not all, some of us here at the Institute, notably including Jacob Kirkegaard and myself, expressed great confidence all through the crisis that the euro would not only survive but remain intact and come out stronger at the other end of the tunnel. We did that on the view not only that the crisis response mechanisms would work, but also that there would evolve through the crisis and coming out of it a new resolve to complete the EMU. We all knew and said that very openly, and you do too, that the EMU was a halfway house, that the monetary union was created, but there was no full complementary economic union, and that remained to be done. Now, the founding fathers, of course, had in mind doing that soon after the EMU itself was created. Did not happen. Complacency set in, and now part of the exercise, of course, is to avoid any renewed complacency before the further steps are taken that need to be done to move to the completion of the economic and monetary union. Therefore, all of us here have been delighted with the issuance of this new report, this reflection paper on the deepening of the economic and monetary union. We profoundly hope that it, along with the other reports, the 5 presidents' reports and others that have been issued in the last couple of years, will lead to the essential completion of the European economic coordination project, without which we all would fear, even those of us on the optimistic side, that the project could be in jeopardy. So it's a great pleasure for us in our continuing close collaboration with the Commission, its office here in Washington, to host this session today. We've set the session to take place in 2 parts. We will have an initial presentation by the authors of the reflection paper, of the paper itself, with some comments on that and then discussion. We'll break for a quick lunch, and then we'll have an afternoon session in which several scholars here at the Institute lay out U.S. economic experiences that may be helpful in relating to what needs to be done in Europe, and draws on the U.S. experience in suggesting how some of those developments may go. To start off, we are fortunate to have with us David O'Sullivan, the EU's ambassador to the United States. David, of course, has deep experience in the Commission, working on a whole range of trade issues. We were talking before about some of the experiences of the past that have direct relationship to what's going on today in terms of trade policy. But David, I think, has an enormous amount of experience and expertise on these issues. We're going to start with some initial remarks by him. I will then come back, introduce the first panel, and we'll go from there. David.
Fred, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Firstly, my sincere thanks to Fred Bergsten and the Peterson Institute for International Economics for hosting this important conference, Completing Economic and Monetary Union, Views from Europe and Lessons from the US. I'd like to thank Fred for his personal interest and commitment to transatlantic relations in this area. He's been a steadfast friend of the European Union, not unwilling to criticize us. Sometimes he's right. But he has always taken a very positive and forward-looking view about these matters, and we're very grateful for that collaboration. Fred reminded us that he was one of the few American economists who remained optimistic throughout the euro crisis. And of course, he was right. Personally, I am convinced that the euro has been and continues to be a project of enormous importance, which, contrary to some of the doomsayers, is not destined to fail. In fact, quite the contrary. Its creation was not, as some people like to maintain, the result of political hubris, but actually the completion of a long and well thought out process triggered by the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 70s. The process then started with the introduction of the European monetary system in the 1970s, and initially the aim of the EMS was to reduce excessive and damaging currency volatility that created economic and trade tensions across European countries. I remember very vividly the impact of the two oil shocks in 73 and 79, when our national currencies went off like fireworks in a round of competitive devaluation that impoverished us all. And I'm not at all convinced that much though the crisis of 2008 was very damaging and revealed some flaws in the architecture of European monetary union, I'm absolutely convinced that if we still had our national currencies in that crisis, actually Europe would have suffered far more than we did, even with the economic difficulties that we know. With the creation of the single market and the growing intra-European trade, economic and monetary integration leading to the single currency made strong economic sense. In fact, not long after its introduction, the euro rapidly became the second largest reserve currency in the world. And frankly, in the first 10 years, the euro delivered on the promise of the public goods it was designed to achieve: economic stability, low inflation, and economic convergence. And that is sometimes forgotten in the inevitable focus on some of the difficulties after the crisis began in 2008. The euro is part of daily life, and I sometimes think, again, American friends don't fully understand how integral a part of daily life it has become in Europe. For many of our citizens, I think of my own children, the euro is all they have known. And for those of our generation who are a bit older and still remember the joys of multiple currencies, I remember I used to have a jar in my office containing coins from Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, France. I used to carry regularly in my briefcase little envelopes with packages of Deutschmarks and French francs because that was what you had to do when you were traveling around. And believe me, it was actually a bit of a nightmare. And I feel, as a citizen, enormous pride in the single euro, that I can travel all around and I don't even have to think about these issues, except unfortunately when I have to occasionally travel to the UK, but what can I say? But I think really it's very important to understand that this is something which is deeply ingrained for many European people, and notwithstanding the crisis, a sense of pride and a sense of the benefits of this single currency is widely appreciated by our citizens. We're no longer subject to the high inflation, the volatility of exchange rates. Inflation has mostly hovered around 2%. Maybe we'd like it to be a bit higher from time to time. And of course, citizens no longer face exchange rate charges to change currencies when traveling within the euro area. For Europe's businesses, the euro is a significant attraction and benefit, a part of being the single market. Businesses are saving time and money. Businesses invoice about 2/3 of their export and half their import business in euros. It's easier and generally cheaper to borrow money in euros, and the global reach of the euro for business is vastly greater than was possible with previous individual European currencies. For our citizens and business alike, low interest rates means more money and cheaper credit in recent years. For these reasons, we have really seen a very consistent and strong support across all of the European member states for the euro. And euro area governments have saved approximately 50 billion euros in interest paid annually compared to a few years ago, money which can be used more profitably for other investments. Now, of course, that's the positive side, and I do think it's important to underline that because it gets a bit lost in the noise of the crisis. But we also have to acknowledge that the sovereign debt crisis tested the euro. And during this period, it faced, I would almost say, the perfect storm, exposing weaknesses more dramatic than could ever have been expected under normal circumstances. Some of these weaknesses, let us be very frank, were a consequence of member states reaping the benefits of the single currency without making the necessary policy adjustments needed to be part of a single monetary union. And that's one important lesson which has been learned the hard way from this crisis, that if you are part of a monetary union, your national economic policy has to reflect that, and you cannot get too far out of line with the other members of the union. And frankly, during the boom years on the first part of this century, many of our member states did not realize that, or realized it but did not act in the correct way. And therefore, policy mistakes were made. And more fundamentally, the euro area at the beginning of that crisis lacked crucial elements that would have mitigated the downturn, such as the European Stability Mechanism, which we now have, and banking union. In a way, we had to fix the plane while it was still flying, and this was a challenging exercise. Collectively, it was not easy, but we succeeded, and the euro survived the test. It is here to stay and will continue to deliver its public goods. But, and it is an important but, there is more to be done, and we must persist to complete the financial architecture of the euro area. And that is the topic of today's conference, which is the product of close cooperation between the Institute and the Commission. Our collaboration, which includes a study on US lessons for the functioning of EMU that the Peterson Institute has undertaken with DG ECFIN, our Economic and Financial Director General in Brussels, the preliminary results of which will be discussed today, and I think this is a very important piece of work, and thank you for that. Let me just briefly turn to the outlook for the European economy and also maybe some of the politics. Just a year ago, prospects for completing the European Monetary Union looked rather dim, frankly. In the aftermath of the UK referendum on membership, pundits feared that Brexit would weaken the European economy, that fault lines would threaten the survival, perhaps even of the Union. Populist movements, frankly, are the dog that have not barked. They have failed to gain a foothold across Europe. The elections in Austria, in the Netherlands, in France, have all demonstrated that the center has held in Europe in a way that people did not predict a year ago, and perhaps even dramatically so. Therefore, parties supporting a pro-European stance have actually succeeded in recent elections. And so, a year on, these concerns have proven unfounded, and the European economy has shown unexpected resilience. It has absorbed the Brexit shock, which will certainly carry costs in the medium term, but more likely more so for the United Kingdom than for the rest of the European Union. Growth forecasts have been revised up, not down. Unemployment is slowly receding. Political uncertainty has declined dramatically, and there is a sense, after some difficult years, that the outlook is looking more favorable. I have been trying to convey, and members of my staff who are here can say, my motto of the last 2 years has been unrelenting optimism about the future of the European economy, and it was sometimes expressed to a little skepticism here in the United States. I'm glad to see that the economic reality has caught up with my rhetoric. I think the predictions I was making 2 years ago when I first arrived here, that people should be confident and optimistic about the future of the European economy, have actually proven true. And while we should not be complacent, there are many challenges and there are many downside risks. We can face the future with a certain optimism. And in my view, it is all the more propitious that in that slightly more optimistic economic move, the Commission is now putting forward ideas about how we can take forward and complete the process of economic and monetary union. And I do believe that the political stars are also aligning themselves in a way which is favorable to that. If I look at the political agenda of President Macron, if I look at other leaders across Europe, we will have the German elections in September. I'm not going to predict who wins, but what I observe is we have two strongly pro-European candidates, Chancellor Merkel, whose European credentials are impeccable, and President Schulz, a former president of the European Parliament, who has also fairly good European political credentials. So I think whoever wins in Germany, we can be assured it will be a pro-European chancellor anxious to take the European project forward. And the discussions which have taken place on how the EU 27 will go forward after Brexit show a strong determination. And completing EMU and taking forward the ideas contained in the Commission's paper will, in my view, be an important part of that program, which I hope will be engaged on seriously once we have the German elections behind us in September. So that's why it was important on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, the European Commission published its white paper on the future of Europe. It is designed to provide, as President Juncker put it, a contribution to a new chapter of the European project. And the paper presents 5 different scenarios characterizing different degrees of ambition to engage and provoke debate and discussion across Europe on what kind of union our citizens desire. Not just the what, but the how we can get there as well. The white paper is complemented by 5 reflection papers, one of which concerns the deepening of economic and monetary union. Completing economic and monetary union is, of course, an essential part of this new chapter. Many of our citizens have felt disenfranchised or left behind in the wake of globalization. EMU is essential to enhance our ability to deliver growth, employment, and financial stability. Key components for ensuring that our citizens see the value of the European project, that they feel a part of it, and ownership for its progress. I believe the paper you're discussing today provides a pragmatic and constructive contribution, exploring realistic solutions aimed at deepening Europe's economic and monetary union. It considers the steps we need to take to complete the necessary architecture by 2025. Europe, as we know, is a work in progress. It does not have a defined endpoint. It is in constant evolution. I joined the European Commission in 1979 when we were 9 countries and a divided Europe. If you told me that in 2017 I would be standing in Washington explaining the future of Europe at 28 countries, reuniting the continent with a single currency shared by 19 of those countries, people would have laughed and said this is unimaginable. Yet that is where we have come. So please do not underestimate our ability to travel still further, and I believe that that is what we will do. I'm very delighted that we are able to have this discussion. I think the future of Europe is not just an issue for Europeans, even if in the first instance we're the ones who have to decide it. I think the United States has a major strategic interest in the success of that project, both economically and politically and in security terms. And we also greatly value the transatlantic relationship and the need for close cooperation, both in our shared values, in our shared security concerns, but also in our attempts at the joint management of the global international economic and trading world, which was largely created by the United States under United States leadership with strong European support, and which has served us very well. I'm delighted that we have José Leandro and Gabriele Giudice from Brussels joining us today. They were major architects of the paper and will be able to explain it in more detail, and I hope engage in a lively discussion. And we also look forward to hearing the preliminary results of the work of the Peterson Institute. So I wish you a very successful conference. I thank you very much for your interest in this, and once again I really do thank the Peterson Institute for their continued interest and support in the work of the European Union. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you for those very wise and very perceptive words. And let me now, with no ado, get on to the first panel. As David said, we will have the great good fortune to hear from 2 of the lead authors of the reflection paper. José Leandro, who is currently Director for Policy, Strategy, Coordination, and Communication at the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs in the Commission. Prior to that, he was advisor to President Juncker, responsible for preparing the 5 Presidents' report. So he's been in the middle of all this process over the last several years. Prior to that, he was principal advisor for economic affairs in the cabinet of the President of the European Council, and earlier spent a number of years as a senior economist at the World Bank. Gabriele Giudice is now head of the unit called EMU Deepening and Macroeconomy at DG ECFIN. Prior to that, he had the great good fortune to be the deputy director of the EU part of the Troika and responsible for the Greek economic restructuring program, back in the news again this week. You may get a question or 2 on that. Earlier, he had worked on a number of the other specific European adjustment cases. He advised Commissioner Almunia on budget and monetary issues right up until the crisis period, and earlier on had spent a number of years working on the Stability and Growth Pact itself as it was being developed. They will lead off and present the report to us. We then have 2 discussants, Stan Veuger from the American Enterprise Institute, a resident scholar there, editor of the AEI's Economic Perspectives, and recently, last fall in fact, a visiting lecturer in economics at Harvard. He will be followed, and completing the lead-off panel, our own senior fellow Jeromin Zettelmeyer here at the Institute. He's been with us full-time since last September. For the prior 2.5 years, he had been Director General for Economic Policy in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, reporting to Vice Chancellor Sigmar Gabriele, and being the chief economist, essentially, in the German government, representing Germany at the OECD Economic Policy Committee, and being involved in the whole range of international institutions. Before that, Jeromin was Director of Research, Deputy Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And prior to that, he had spent a number of years at the IMF in the research, Western Hemisphere, and European departments after receiving his PhD in economics from MIT. So it's a star-studded panel. We look forward to the lead-off presentation from our colleagues from Brussels, and then a couple of comments from the Washington perspective. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here today at such a prestigious institution like the Peterson Institute, and thank you for organizing this conference and giving us the opportunity to share with you the latest ideas from the Commission on the future of the monetary union. As this slide here says, and the ambassador mentioned it before, completing the monetary union is not an end in itself. It's a way of making a better life for everyone, if I may say so. As the ambassador said, this paper, which was published on the 31st of May, is part of a series of papers that the Commission has put forward recently on several issues like globalization, the social dimension, and then the EMU, the future of the EMU, following the white paper that was published in March. And this paper basically builds on ideas that have been already put forward in the so-called 5 Presidents report, which was a report produced under the leadership of President Juncker, together with the President of the Eurogroup, the President of the Central Bank, the President of the European Parliament. And this paper basically builds on that and tries, the aim of this paper is basically to move the debate forward. It is not a blueprint. It is not a take it or leave it proposal. It is a series of suggestions and ideas. And basically the objective is to try to bridge the narratives that are out there about the future of the monetary union and basically which have blocked the debate. At the risk of oversimplifying, you basically have 2 main narratives out there about the future of the EMU. One, which I would call the back to Maastricht narrative, is one that says that what the EMU needs is a rules-based fiscal framework, no additional risk sharing, in addition to what has already been decided so far with the SSM, the ESM, and all that, and in particular, no common deposit insurance. It says also that the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt in banks' balance sheets should be reviewed, and the risk-free status of sovereign debt should come to an end, and there would be an automatic debt restructuring as soon as a country applies for ESM support. ESM is European Stability Mechanism. That's one narrative, which I would call back to Maastricht. Then there is another narrative, which is the one spelled out in the 5 Presidents report, which is a more integrationist narrative, which basically says, yes, the monetary union needs risk sharing. There is 2 ways of doing risk sharing, through private sector channels, capital markets union and banking union, and public sector channels, fiscal stabilization. It says that euro area needs a fiscal stabilization function. And basically, these are the 2 narratives out there. And the debate has been blocked. And so what this paper tries to do is to bridge these 2 narratives, right? And by taking things from each of them in a way that would be economically sound, and politically feasible. So let me quickly walk you through the main ideas in the paper. Looking backward, what we've seen is that the euro has brought many advantages, and the ambassador mentioned them right before. One of them is certainly low inflation. I'm sure many people still remember the 70s and the 80s, where inflation was 15, 20% annual. So since then, there has been a considerable convergence downward on inflation, to an extent that today we would actually like inflation to be a little bit higher, because it would help the adjustment in the euro area. The other thing that this slide shows is that even though some people may be ambivalent about the European Union, a vast majority likes the euro. And that's what the graph down, the lower graph shows. 70% of the population think the euro is a good thing. What we've been experiencing over the last few years is that the euro area was undergone a very large shock from which we are now recovering. And it's true that the recovery has been, compared to the US, for example, more protracted and weaker. That we recognize. But we are now in 2017 in the 5th year of growth. The recovery is beginning to be more broad-based, more solid. But we must admit that growth is still probably not reaching the escape velocity, if you see what I mean. Basically, our latest forecast showed that growth between 2016 and 18 would be around 1.7, 1.8. So flat, not accelerating. We've seen also that investment is starting to pick up. Still from very low levels, and it has not completely recovered to the pre-crisis level. And we also see a considerable reduction in unemployment. That being said, we are still in a situation where, even though the unemployment figure has come down to the lowest level in many years now, there is still considerable slack in the labor market. In other words, if you look at hours worked, it have not recovered completely. And a large share of the new jobs that have been created over the last 3 years, about 5 million new jobs have been created. A large share of these jobs are part-time jobs, and there is significant, still a large share of the people would like to work more hours and are not able. So what I'm saying is that even though unemployment is coming down, which is a good thing, slack in the economy persists, and which justifies the continuation of supportive macroeconomic policies. So, why do we need to complete the monetary union? Basically because we've seen that this crisis has, showed that the incomplete nature of the monetary union is one of the reasons for the weaker recovery that we have experienced, especially when compared to the US, as I said. There has been persistent economic and social divergence over the last 7 years. Divergence in the euro area is a real issue. There are still sources of financial vulnerability, high public and private debt. It's not just a sovereign debt crisis, it's a debt crisis. And if you take private debt, it's higher than public debt, including in some core countries. If you take the Netherlands, for example, private debt is very high. What we've also, one of the lessons of this crisis is that the euro area lacked a fiscal stabilization tool to complement the national fiscal stabilizers, and these aggravated the crisis. And when the shock hit fiscal policy in the member states, because of under market pressure, was pushed into a pro-cyclical mode, and which has aggravated the crisis. If we had had a fiscal stabilization function at the euro area level that would complement the fiscal stabilizers, it would probably have been avoided. The other reason why we need to complete the monetary is because the governance and democratic deficit and our governance structure is still very complex. So this graph just shows the divergence on unemployment levels. This one shows investment, and as I said, the investment is now picking up since end of last year or so. And as the recovery progresses, the situation is more promising. Global demand is increasing. Capacity utilization is now very high. Corporate profits are high. And financing conditions are much more favorable now than they were a few years ago, in large part thanks to the ECB. And so the prospects for investment are better. But still, we are not seeing investment recovering completely to the pre-crisis level, and this is one of the issues. Until we see that, the sustainability and the solidity of this recovery would still be questionable. The second issue that is not shown here is wages. Wages have started to pick up, but not to the extent that we would consider good for the recovery. And until we see these two things, investment and wages, which are important both to maintain private consumption, which has been the main engine of growth so far, and second, pushing inflation higher to facilitate the adjustment. Until we see that, this recovery needs to continue to be supported with supportive fiscal and monetary policies. This graph shows the considerable fragmentation that characterized financial markets at the heat of the crisis. Now these things they have now started to converge, but still fragmentation is there. The problem with this is that it complicates the conduction on monetary policy if you have fragmented financial markets, because the transmission mechanisms do not work as well. The other graph shows sovereign debt. Now, what we have today is a construction which we call an unsustainable equilibrium. Basically, we have a construction in which we have an incomplete banking union. We've done a lot of progress on that, but it's still incomplete. We don't have a backstop or the resolution fund, and we don't have yet a common deposit insurance. And on the other hand, we also have an incomplete capital markets union. So this is on the financial side, we have an incomplete banking and capital markets union. We also have no fiscal stabilization function at the macro level, right? At the euro area level, there is no fiscal stabilization function. And at the same time, we have asymmetric fiscal rules. The Stability and Growth Pact puts a lot of emphasis on correcting deficits, but cannot force countries in surplus to spend more. So with a construction like that, what happens is you have basically insufficient private and public sector risk sharing, because you don't have in the private sector channels, the banking union, the capital markets union to absorb shocks. And you don't have a fiscal stabilization function to absorb shocks either. So insufficient private and public sector risk sharing. And at the same time, it's also impossible in a construction like this to achieve simultaneously an appropriate fiscal stance at the aggregate euro area level and an optimal distribution of the fiscal effort that takes into account the balance between stabilization and sustainability at the national level. So it is impossible in a construction like this to achieve simultaneously these two things. And the whole is combined with weak or challenged democratic accountability. One of the consequences of this construction is also that it leads to overburdening of monetary policy, right? So the ECB is left to make the heavy lifting. So this graph just illustrates how complex the governance system still is in the euro area. You have different channels of accountability, you have common tools, and you have intergovernmental tools, like DSM, for example. So it's not straightforward. So how do we move forward? These are the guiding principles that should guide the way forward in the completion of the EMU. First is indeed that the aim is not completion, the aim is to create more jobs and growth and social fairness. The process should be open to all member states, not just to those in the euro area. It should be an inclusive process, transparent, involving in the discussion the non-euro area member states. And then the need to better combine risk sharing and risk reduction, or in other words, responsibility and solidarity. So those are the guiding principles for the proposals that are in this paper. Here you have basically a summary of the ideas that are in the reflection paper. Basically, in the upper part, which we call the financial union, you have the need to complete the banking union and the capital markets union. You would also be ready to discuss the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt and how to foster a greater diversification of banks' sovereign exposures. But for that to happen, you would need to have a common safe asset. This is the financial part. Then you have the economic and fiscal union, where there are ideas on how to put what shape the fiscal stabilization function could take, and at the same time linked to a process of how to restart the convergence machine in the euro area. And then a number of ideas on how to improve governance and the accountability. Basically here, you have the main difference between this paper and the 5 presidents report that was put forward last 2 years ago is on the upper part, where for the first time the Commission puts on the table the idea of discussing the risk-free status of sovereign debt in banks' balance sheets. And this is a way of increasing market discipline for fiscal and financial policies. But at the same time, you have mechanisms for shock absorption, the completion of the banking union and the stabilization function. So we think it's a good balance between, on one hand, more incentives for fiscal and financial discipline on one hand, and on the other hand, tools for better absorbing shocks. And actually, this construction would be consistent with a radical simplification of the Stability and Growth Pact. I'm going to go very quickly through each of the parts. So, the paper puts forward a roadmap with measures to be taken by 2019, and then measures to be taken for the longer term, 2025. Basically, until 2019, the emphasis is on, as I said, completing the banking union by putting in place the backstop. We think that the backstop, the best way of doing that would be through a credit line of the ESM to the resolution fund. This should be fiscally neutral. And then agreeing on the proposal that the Commission has put forward for a common deposit insurance. This is where the emphasis is until 2019. Then for 2019, and sorry, I forgot to mention the completion of the Capital Markets Union. You saw that last week the Commission came up with a midterm review of the Capital Markets Union and ideas on how to push it forward, including steps towards the creation of a single European capital markets supervisor. And at the same time, the paper discusses the idea of fostering the diversification of banks' exposures and discusses one of the proposals that have been put forward, the so-called sovereign bond-backed securities, or SBs. And for those who are more familiar with this thing, this is an idea that is put forward by Brunnermeier and others. And we say that this is an interesting idea that should be explored, but this is probably not the safe asset with capital letters. Beyond 2019, the idea would be continuing implementation of the Capital Markets Union, rollout of the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, or a modified version of it, the transition towards the issuance of European safe asset, and the change to regulatory treatment of sovereign debt. Here, the sequencing is key. In other words, changes to the risk-free status of sovereign debt could only happen if 2 conditions would be met: a full banking union in place and a safe asset also in place that would replace the role that sovereign debt plays currently in the financial system. And the safe asset should be something that is not the result of mutualization of sovereign debt, since this is forbidden by the treaty. So the question is what this safe asset could be. And I'll leave now the floor to Gabriele, who is going to tell you what this safe asset should be.
Well, thank you. Let's see if this comes a bit higher. So let me move to the next slide to cover one aspect on which has been a lot of attention, is exactly what we might mean as the safe asset. This graph is not in the reflection paper, but we put it here for you so that we can have a little bit more organized discussion. As José already said, there is work ongoing on the sovereign-backed securities, which we put in this graph quite close to the origin. This graph is trying to assess the various options which are on the market, let's say on the academic market, along two dimensions. One is the liquidity, stability, and the governance, or the shared governance which they imply. And on the other side, the other axis would be the more market incentives and discipline. And so we try to present what is there on the market. Let me start from the bottom. So this idea of the accountability bonds, which has been floated mainly from, let's say, the German world, where in fact there is the idea of doing some tranching of the bonds which are issued by governments, and with the junior set of bonds which are issued in moments of difficulties when the country is no longer complying with fiscal discipline, and therefore it's a junior ranking. So this would be definitely something which can improve pressure on the country, but the problem is that it is not a pooled instrument, so it would be just tranching at national level, and therefore doesn't bring anything in terms of addressing the functioning of the European market. We put the SBIS, which is the idea of pooling and tranching through securitization, where in fact we have the feeling that it could potentially be constructed as an instrument. It requires some regulatory change in terms of the treatment of securitized products in order to see the light. But even that, once it is created, might be a new asset class, rather safe, at least as concerns the senior part, but it might not be that big. And in principle, it doesn't bring any difference to the market discipline because it doesn't change the function of the underlying bond market. So it's close to the axis. On the top side, there are the Euro bonds, which is what is always referred to as the first idea, which is a fully mutualized product where all the issuances and all past liabilities are put together. And therefore, it is backed by joint and full guarantees by member states. So this would definitely bring the benefits of liquidity. Would be the deepest market possible created in Europe, but there is discussions about the implication in terms of incentives for policies, because the only way to function properly would be to fully share the governance, or in fact there is the capacity to influence national policies directly, in absence of which, in fact, the problem of moral hazard appears, and therefore we have placed that on the types on that side of the graph. You probably are aware of the proposals of the blue-red bonds made by Bruegel in 2010, which is a scaled-down version of the mutualized Euro bonds. They say that it would be a partial common issuance only up to 60%. Therefore, it would be a pretty liquid market, while the Euro bond would be 90% of GDP. But okay, still relies, given the size, on the mutualized approach. Although there is a tranching of the underlying bonds. And it would have some beneficial implications in terms of incentives on national bonds, but it remains affected by this assumption that mutualization would be a key component. Then there are two other types of ideas which have not really very much been discussed. As I said, the SBIS, there is an ongoing work at the ESRB, with the central bankers, we are participating as well to try to understand how this product could be created. But there are other two on which there's been little work. The idea of the Euro bills is to do some tranching of the bonds across maturities, so up to 2 years will be jointly issued with the central issuer. This could be about 20% of GDP or even more, and the rest is done left to member states. And then there is another idea which is not as spread. It's implicitly mentioned in a number of papers made by Monti or Tremonti Juncker in 2010. Also, the Commission put in one of his green papers, puts a reference to this. The idea of doing tranching first the issuance of member states, and then pool only the part which is the more senior of each member state. And the difference between that and the red-blue bonds would be that the size would be smaller, and therefore there would not be a need to have a mutualization. So this, for the moment, let's say this, the choice which we have there on the let's say academic market. We think it's worth studying this set of proposals, and the Commission has announced that we look at that, and particularly focusing on this area where there is less relevance. The important thing is that we need to create or find an instrument which is large enough to replace or become the benchmark across the banking system in Europe, so that it is resistant or resilient to evolution in national bond markets, sovereign bond markets, and therefore also resistant to potential changes into the evaluation of their risks and even in case of defaults. And therefore we need to have something which is big enough. But we can come back to this, I guess there will be questions. So let me focus on the other two areas of the report where we also come with suggestions on how to foster convergence. In the past, we used to talk, on the Five Presidents report, used to talk about an economic union and the fiscal union. Here they're presented jointly because there are two expressions of the functioning of the governance which bring, in our view, positive developments in terms of the convergence of policies. And the suggestion is to try to use better what we have already in terms of instruments, in particular using the procedure which have been developed over the last years, and now they're called under the definition of EU semester, where there is a process of coordination of policies in the first half of the year in Brussels, and then national governments should deliver on policies in the second half of the year. There's been, let's say, a lot of aggregation of different strands of work, the fiscal and the macroeconomic imbalances, and this is worth investing further. In particular, also giving more relevance to what we call the recommendation for the euro area, which are given now every year. So we try to give a top-down vision to policies to be done at national level. And then this process allows to specify what will be consistent for each member state in this framework. That's the first two bullets there. And other important areas where we are trying to develop possible ways to create incentives for member states to deliver is to better use the budget, where in fact at the moment there's very little conditionality in the use of the resources which are given to member states, and there is here the request or the intention to link the provision of funds to compliance with the reforms which are identified in the process of this coordination. And then a new idea is the creation of a stabilization function. José already explained why we need it, and we came with some ideas. In the next slides I will go more in detail. Finally, a point is we created this structure, a service for the provision of technical assistance at European level, which was created mainly to provide assistance to Greece, but we have now settled this, made it permanent, and there is a capacity now to support member states at large with the technical assistance, so this should help also to foster the convergence process. So here we have the indication of the three main ideas which we have put forward for providing a stabilization function at European level. The European Investment Protection Scheme has the main objective of ensuring that investment is not cut during downturns, which has been a recurrent feature in the last decades in Europe, and therefore would be important to set aside funds centrally, which can then be released in terms of transfers to member states, in particular in the case of very large shocks. Another scheme which has already been studied more in depth is the unemployment insurance scheme, which would be a scheme providing support to the national schemes in periods of stress, also major unemployment increases And finally, a third option is the idea of a rainy day fund, which would accumulate the funds regularly to distribute them in a discretionary basis. We also referred to the idea of the euro area budget in the report. However, it's considered to be an idea more for the longer term because it requires a significant transfer of competences, including in the allocation distribution, let's say, spheres, while these will be mainly stabilization instruments. The last point is let's say the third element of the package. One point, in fact, which we should not compare to the five presidents' report. There was a fourth union, which was the political union. In this report, there is no reference to it anymore as a political union because it created a lot of anxieties in the past. So, but here we focus more on what is the important changes in the institutional structures, which will be necessary to overcome the complexity which was presented before. So there is the idea of reinforcing the framework at European level, using streamlining mainly what we have. There are the ideas, for example, in the short term, but it might require treaty changes to have a double hat for the commissioner who is in charge of economic and financial affairs and becoming also the president of the Eurogroup, the chair. So there is ideas to try to make this process better in the short term, in order also to be able to better defend, promote, and project the interest of the euro area, both within an internal deliberations, but also vis-à-vis the rest of the world. There is proposals which will be made by the Commission also as concerns the external representation of the euro area, which are blocked at the moment with the Council, but we need to find ways to reactivate. There is, of course, a big steps to be taken as concerns the relations with the Parliament. There is already an agreement between the Commission and the Parliament to have more transparency and dialogue. We would like this to be extended to other institutions and then formalized. Finally, there is one point which is now very much in the debate. It's the role of the ESM and the evolution of this institution into what is possible a European Monetary Fund, which is in some way a way to project the view that we need a stronger institution at central level. In the report, we take the specific approach that we need to build the institutions by developing a treasury, where in fact we could put together existing competences and the new ones which will come once there are developments according to this framework. So we already do the economic and fiscal surveillance, which is a prerogative of the Commission, and there will be the addition, the stabilization function, and possibly the coordination of the European and the issuance of a European safe asset. And then there is, on the right side, there is what the ESM does, which is an intergovernmental institution, which is providing liquidity assistance to member states, and to which also a new competence could be given as part of the banking union, completing the banking union, which would become the backstop for the single resolution fund. So these two, the ESM could continue doing the job as it is now, and in an intergovernmental approach. Possibly yes, but we think that already the current structure has reached its limits. There is very, very significant, questions about the democratic accountability of this process. And therefore, it is important in our view that any development would be done within the framework of the EU. And then in that context, one can see which is the institution which can deliver the various competences. As I said, now it's the Commission doing the surveillance. We would have to see how this could evolve going forward. So that's basically my last slide. The next two are also a bit complicated to read, but the main point here is to give you the perception of how complicated the package is. There are many, many dimensions. Here is only the ideas which we have projected for the period of 2017-2019, which is basically until the end of the mandate of the current European institutions, the Commission and Parliament. The mandate is mid-2019. 19. So there is quite a number of deliverables, in particular the banking union, but also to launch the preparations of both the safe asset and the fiscal stabilization function, which the Commission has indicated there will be further work. And then in the next phase, which is 2025, will be the start of the implementation of a number of these elements, provided a decision is taken in the next couple of years, or at least identified, and many of them would require treaty changes. So I would think I can stop here, and I would welcome the discussion. Thank you.
It works remarkably well. Oh, there we go. All right. First of all, thank you for writing this paper. I thought this was very interesting. Thank you to the Peterson Institute and to the European Commission for giving me the opportunity to offer a few thoughts here on this reflection paper. I was born in the south of the Netherlands. So I will try to voice a more back to Maastricht style tone on the future of the European Monetary Union. But let me turn to the content. So this reflection paper very strongly reflects a desire to deepen the European Monetary Union, to complete it. I felt that it read a little more like a blueprint than like a reflection paper, but I'm not sure the authors would like to adopt that terminology. One of the things that struck me as I read the paper is that the timeline for the process as outlined is very much driven by politics, right? So there are things to be done before 2019, the date of the next elections to the European Parliament, and there are things to be done in the distant future. Now, that's really the only appearance politics makes in the reflection paper, and I will come back to that later. I understand that talk about a political union makes people nervous, but there are, of course, important political considerations to take into account when you propose a process of further integration that goes as far as some of the ideas in this paper. So the starting point of the reflection paper is that the euro has been largely successful. It gives some data from opinion polls in support of the euro. It shows. Perhaps most saliently, it shows that prices and interest rates and levels of inflation have converged within the European Monetary Union, especially pre-crisis, and that is a sign of, and it interprets that as a sign of economic or financial integration, even though it may perhaps have been, certainly for some prices, more a sign of implied bailout promises or transfers. I would hesitate to interpret some of the figures shown in the paper as strong evidence for success of the monetary union. But in fairness, the paper then continues, and it does recognize three key weaknesses, and it aims to address them by focusing on further integration of a sometimes covert kind. So the first weakness is still sort of a lack of convergence of national economies, right? So the fundamental idea here is that for a single monetary policy to be effective, economies need to be at the same position in the business cycle at any time. This is particularly important, of course, when market discipline and international agreements restrict the availability of countercyclical fiscal policy. But of course, what even perfect synchronization would not do is equalize the amplitude of cycles, which has varied quite immensely over the years. So here, what I show you is the standard deviation in unemployment rates normalized by the average unemployment rate for the various states of the United States, for the various countries in the European Monetary Union, and for NUTS 2 regions. Right? So here what we see is that there is a massive range of unemployment rates in the monetary union, even this many years after the crisis first started. Some of that is certainly driven by Spain. Now, this variation is large, and it seems large enough that it's hard to imagine that feasible policies targeting labor market integration and movement of people can really make a difference here. So this is sort of a quick, more suggestive regression of cross-country migration flow, net migration flows on unemployment differentials. What you see is that migration flows within the European Monetary Union are actually more responsive to unemployment rate differentials than in the United States, but of course they start from a much lower base. So this would lead one to believe that it's large cultural differences, language barriers, things like that, that stand in the way of the kind of labor flows that you would need, not necessarily minor policy and licensing issues to be addressed. So the paper recognizes this, I think, implicitly, and it therefore turns to fiscal policy, right? Bans, perhaps to some extent, at the national level. The paper, I think, quite cleverly turns to what I would call off-budget fiscal stabilizers, right? So countries are not necessarily allowed to pursue the counter-cyclical fiscal policy they would like to carry out. And so the idea is, and we saw some of that at the end of the presentation, is to come up with a way around that, right? Where through policies like unemployment insurance, reinsurance, and investment insurance. Now, I think that is clever because it gets around some of the straitjacket problems that the monetary union, I think, has struggled with. But of course, other than sort of sovereign wealth type rainy day funds, these programs do rely on risk sharing of the type that is made harder, not easier, by more synchronized business cycles. So that's an aspect that I think points towards a bit of an internal contradiction there between the fiscal policy initiatives and the broader economic convergence agenda. I would also be a little concerned that these types of programs can be scaled up anytime soon, and I think certainly the presentation recognized this, that for unemployment insurance, reinsurance to work at the scale needed, I think you would need more convergence than we currently have for it to be politically feasible. And I also think that these programs are simply too small to address the pretty significant debt overhang problems that some of the member states still face. Now, again, in fairness to the paper, the reflection paper also recognizes that weakness. And so I think the emphasis on financial integration could be read as implicit recognition that something needs to be done about the debt position of a number of the member states. I'd go further and I'd say a more cynical reading, sort of a Maastricht-style reading of the suggestions for completion of the banking and capital market unions would suggest that the goal is to sever the link between stability of national banking systems and the health of sovereign balance sheets without either addressing why that home bias persists in financial institutions or the health of the sovereign balance sheets as such. I think that latter bit is worrisome because still quite a few countries have higher debt to GDP ratios than they did in 2008 despite years of adjustment. And so transfers in all but name would basically be responsible for addressing those issues, which I would worry risks moving what are the currently existing safe assets into slightly less safe territory. And I think this is a good point to return to politics. I think that the sort of the constellation of suggestions goes a little beyond what I would imagine voters in Finland or Germany or the Netherlands would like to see happen. I think that a lot of the programs are organized in a good sort of covert. Covert sounds too negative, but I think politically feasibly packaged way, and I think that may be good in the short run. I would worry a little bit that once some of the mechanisms proposed here would actually be deployed and used, they would trigger discontent. And while I agree that polling for the euro is typically very strong, polling for the EU as a whole is a little weaker. Support for referenda is pretty strong in a number of countries. And I think we've seen in the past that those referenda are tough to win for the pro-integration side, not just in Britain, but in core countries like the Netherlands and France. And so I would, even though this report may not be the place for it, I do think that it is very important before going further down this integration path to try and, as the report puts it, anchor democratic accountability a little more. And so that part of the paper focused on strengthening the architecture of the monetary union and anchoring the democratic accountability. I felt was very heavy on the strengthening of the architecture and not so heavy on the democratic accountability. And I worry that will lead to trouble down the road. But overall, I think this is a good. If you read between the lines aggressively enough, I think a very realistic report on the future of the European Monetary Union. And with that, I thank you.
Great. It was a real pleasure to read the report and to be able to discuss it. So I really think it's excellent. It's coherent and well argued. So intellectually, it's top notch. There's no dumbing down this time. I'm sort of leaving open what the other time was, but I don't mean the Five President report. It's courageous because it does, in fact, raise some issues that are red flags for both sides. It's constructive because it's balanced and it may contain the ingredients for a grand bargain. I mean, that was the explicit aim of the report, I think, and I think it has largely attained that. And then the final point is it's an appropriate mix of specificity and sketchiness, right? So it is actually quite specific on ideas, aims, and also on the sequencing. And even though, like Stan said, the sequencing is partly politically driven, I also think it has something to do with the logic of the various proposals, and in particular with the aim of avoiding market disruptions. And I think that's generally well done, with some exceptions, which I'll go into. But then it is appropriately open on some issues of institutional design, and that I think is also good because, in truth, we don't know yet, and why throw things out that we might have to backtrack on in the future. Now, let me maybe step back and give people sort of my reading on why the problem that this report is trying to solve or contribute to solving is so incredibly hard. So roughly that's the exercise. We're trying to maximize some sort of joint European or Euro area welfare function on using institutional design, right? That's at least how I interpret the problem. But we have some really, really tough conditions, right? And the conditions are first what I call the northern red line, which is no redistribution ex ante, right? So Stan talked about redistribution. I think it is clear to everyone that there will have to be redistribution ex post. That's the nature of risk sharing. I think even people in the north, not everyone in my country understands that distinction, but certainly the more sophisticated people in the Ministry of Finance in Germany do understand the distinction between ex ante and ex post. And so the real no-no is on redistribution ex ante, predictable redistribution. Then for the South, I think what they're really panicked about is that any ideas here, for example, on sovereign exposures of banks or something like that, is going to trigger the next crisis, right? Sharp increases in yields, making the balance sheets of their banks even weaker, and so forth. So that's their red line. Then we have this democratic accountability thing, which is sort of everyone's red line, everyone's favorite condition, even though I think there are various differences on what people mean by that. And then there's a really hard one, which is number 4, which is a worry about unintended consequences. So, in other words, it wouldn't be enough to have a grand bargain that meets 1, 2, and 3. You would also have to reassure the South that small deviations from that grand bargain, for example, in the sequencing or shocks, do not then go over that southern red line. And the same thing for the Germans, right? So the reason why, when I was in the German government, people at the Ministry of Finance and I so often disagreed wasn't so much that I could not make a case, an intellectual case, that a true completion of EMU, if you like, wouldn't be possible on German terms. So basically I made an argument, we can do it. We can both have a lot more risk sharing and get the incentives right. But after I'd made the case, the argument was, yes, but this would never work in practice. So, in the end, there would be some change during the execution where, somehow the South would take out the critical bit that really protects us against redistribution, and then we end up paying for everyone. So it's this worry about robustness in actually being executing the promise. And from the point of view of Italy, it's exactly the same, except what they're worried about is the crisis. They say, oh, these are wonderful plans you have, but in practice, something's going to go wrong, and everything's going to blow up. Okay, so that's what makes it extremely difficult. And by the way, a small side point, even the democratic accountability point is sometimes in conflict with the other two. And the reason is that, certainly the European Parliament's interpretation for what democratic accountability means is that fiscal decisions are taken in the European Parliament, right? Then you immediately violate condition number 1, no redistribution across countries. Okay, so the result, predictably, is what Dr. Seuss so aptly described in his tale about the north-going Zacks and the south-going Zacks that have been both trained never to budge. And so they meet in the middle of the desert. And it happened that both of them came to a place where they bumped. There they stood, foot to foot, face to face, okay? So that pretty much describes where we are right now. So there's a genuine deadlock, for example, on things like banking union. There's a true deadlock. And so let me just remind you of what the substance behind that deadlock is. So essentially the South wants less interference in national policies, more flexible rules, of course extra risk sharing and stabilization options and EDIS. And then it's okay with this idea of a capital market union. Well, the North was pretty much exactly the opposite, so more interference in national policies, at least the policies of the South, right? The Germans don't want too much interference in their own policies, but certainly in those of the South, and less flexible rules. No extra risk sharing and stabilization options that could give rise to redistribution. And of course, the hard line is that any risk sharing and stabilization options can ultimately give rise to redistribution, because even if you can write down a scheme for them that doesn't, it can always be abused. And so you always have to be careful. And of course, absolutely no EDIS. And then a capital markets union, maybe. So based on that, the only thing that we're going to make progress on in the next 5 years is capital markets union. And it's easy to understand why, because it's a way to more risk sharing that doesn't involve fiscal commitments, right? So that's sort of the minimum. But we are going to need a lot more. So what is the solution? Well, let me first tell you what Dr. Seuss's prediction is, what will happen. And they built it right over the highway, those two stubborn Zacks, and left them there standing unbudged in their tracks. So this, I believe, actually has some deep meaning, because if we don't get our act together in Europe, the rest of the world's going to ignore us. We're going to be stuck. And in the meantime, the Chinese, this might be a parable, by the way, for One Belt, One Road. In the meantime, the Chinese, and then when they wake up and come to their senses again, the Americans, they're going to get met, they're going to push globalization, okay? And we're going to be stuck below the bridge from Beijing to California. Okay, so what is DG ECFIN solution? So Gabriele's and José's. It's basically these 4 points. So they sort of want a centrist package that takes, if you like, good elements from both sides, So they're quite big on improved incentives for good national policies, which is sort of the northern agenda, if you like, and they want to do it both through EU funding and through market discipline. They are also remind us that, you know, financial sector risk reduction is actually an item that the Commission has been on for a while. There's nothing new in here, but they restate some of the proposals. Then we have a long list of ideas for you know, institutional ideas for more risk sharing and stabilization. And here they also repeat some things that have been said in the past. But they also repeat, like was already in the Five President report, that these stabilization mechanisms that they have in mind here should rule out permanent transfers, which is sort of a little bit the German red line. And then, finally, it's about very careful sequencing, right? And so the careful sequencing is what's supposed to keep the Italian red line from being crossed, right? And particularly, they have this idea that EDIS needs to come first before anything else to sort of reassure, if you like, the Italian depositor, or they don't speak, and you know, depositors in weaker countries that their banks are not going to collapse because of more market discipline or things like that. Okay, let me first mention one point. What's new, right? As a discussant, you always have to say what's new. And so here the benchmark is the Five Presidents report. And so there are actually two really important things that are new in this report. So first of all, there's just way more emphasis on incentives, improving incentives facing national policies than in the Five Presidents report. So I did, you know, what this primitive thing that people do, but I think in this case it really means something. I did word counts. So I searched the Five Presidents report yesterday for mentions of incentives, and there's only one, and that's in a box, which I suspect you wrote, José. In the box about you know, the fiscal capacity, there's a mention of incentives, otherwise there's nothing. And there are four important mentions in the reflection paper. And then I typed in the words market discipline, and there's exactly zero mention of that in the Five Presidents reports. And there are three in important places in the reflection paper. And then the other really big difference is that while the Five Presidents report does actually talk about maybe addressing the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures, it is mentioned in the banking chapter. The idea of a euro area level safe asset is not mentioned. And this report pushes that idea, even though quite understandably without having details. And I truly think that those are absolutely key, and they also belong together. And so I think this is the most important contribution of the report, to have put that into the debate. Now I have two quibbles, so this slide and one more, and then I'm done. So one quibble on behalf of the North. So there is this principle of no permanent transfers, which was already in the Five Presidents reports in this box, and it's repeated here, but it's applied only to stabilization mechanism, and it's not really developed beyond what was already in the report. But it's important, I mean, for you guys to understand that to a German mind, this applies more broadly than just stabilization. And that it's slightly stronger than just no permanent transfers expected, conditioning on current policies, right? Basically, the condition is like what I've written down there, that, you know, capital TIJ is transfers from country I, which take that as Germany, to country J, and AJ are the actions, policy actions of country J. And so the condition that has to hold for each and every proposal that you make is that the expectation of transfers from I to J for any action that country J might take should be zero. Okay, that's the no moral hazard condition. And so the reason why the North, the Germans, don't like EDIS, also the Belgians, also the Dutch, also the Finns, is that it violates this condition. And it violates that for two reasons. It violates it right now because of legacy debt, but it also violates it in steady state. And the reason of that is that just because we have centralized supervision in the banking system doesn't mean that all the policy actions then can lead to undermining the solvency of banks have been centralized. And in particular, we have continued national control over policy areas like housing, tax policies, obviously, corporate insolvency frameworks. And as long as we have them, there is effectively a shared responsibility between the national level and the European for the health of the banking system. And so the idea of complete pooling of risks is wrong. It would violate this thing. And so I think this may have to be reflected probably in the timing, but also in the design of EDIS. And there's actually an easy solution, which is you have the three stages. So I think if you just stop at stage 2, that might be one way to go. But there may be better ideas. So again, I'm not saying EDIS is not important. It is important, but this needs to be addressed more carefully than it has been done. And in particular, this notion that once we are through with the current banking risk reduction plans, that then that condition is satisfied, that's not correct. Now I quibble on behalf of the South. So, the biggest disappointment from this report is that what I think as a first-order issue, namely reform of the SGP, is again put on the very back burner. I mean, it's literally mentioned in the last sentence of the report. But it's a first-order issue. There's the procyclicality of the current rules. There's measurement error, right? I mean, there's very convincing research at Bruegel and other places that it's incredibly hard to actually manage this thing because you have to, you condition policy recommendations on real-time estimation of a structural balance, which is off by about 0.5 of GDP on average. I mean, how can you do that? It's a completely crazy approach. And then it's a constant source of political friction. Now, I understand why you're procrastinating on it. It's a hugely controversial reform project, right? So it would clearly have raised big flags, made this report even more unpopular with the Germans if you had put that into the forefront. But I have a slight suspicion, which is that, deep down you like the SGP. And you like it because it gives you a lot of discretion. Now, why does it do that? Okay. First of all, everyone here has to understand that the reason why the SGP is so complex is because you have to adapt it to the requirements of the real world without wanting to give the Commission much discretion. And as a result, there is a rule for every bloody contingency. Okay, this is what creates this impression of management and what makes it completely unreasonable, right? So in that sense, the SGP officially doesn't give very much discretion to the Commission because, there's a rule for every contingency. And those rules are actually written in the Vademecum and in the Code of Conduct and all these good things. You can read them up. However, no one understands them at this point. And so this is why, at the end of the day, the Commission does have a huge amount of discretion because it's the only one that can interpret the rules. And I think where you need to be giving a little push is that, basically there are various ways of creating incentives and discipline. One way is for the Commission to go out there and harass governments. And the other one is for the Commission to take itself back and let markets work. And so I vastly prefer the second one, purely for political reasons. Because for me, the Commission and generally, Brussels is the symbol of the European project. So if you guys get beaten up all the time, ultimately people lose faith in Europe. And so if you think about how to strengthen incentives, you should worry about that point. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much to all 4 speakers for getting us launched. I want to go to questions from the audience right away, but I want to ask one first. Obviously, this is a highly political exercise. There was discussion of some of the politics, some of the political factors, the North, the South, et cetera. But there was one huge political development, some would argue the biggest that the EU has faced in its history, which is now about to launch, and that's Brexit. So, what are the implications of Brexit for everything that you have talked about? Is that the reason why, as Jeromin said, maybe you're being a little more ambitious and a little more courageous these days. I mean, it's too bad we have Brexit, but maybe it clears the decks for some things. In any event, comment as you can on how that big development affects this big development.
Thank you. How do All right, okay. Now that's a very good question. Actually, we see Brexit as more of as an opportunity to move on these issues rather than as a threat. And in some of these issues that we've been discussing, for example, the Capital Markets Union, the UK was rather skeptical. And for example, the creation of a single supervisor for the Capital Markets Union. The fact that the UK will be leaving the Union opens an opportunity for progressing on that front, which we think it's a good thing for the EMU. Now, on the other hand, it's a pity that the UK is leaving, because if there is one member state that has always been very supportive of the completion of the monetary union as being the UK, they understood very clearly that a strong, resilient, stable monetary union was in their own interest. And even in the most difficult times of the crisis between 2010 and 2012 at the European Council, the UK was extremely constructive and said, for example, banking union, we think it's a very good idea. We stay away from it, but you guys, you should do it. And they were very supportive. So, you know, it's a pity that they are leaving.
How about the safe asset?
Well, this was not discussed at the time. Now, this is, as Jeromin said, it's a new concept that has now been put on the table in the context of this paper, and which will deserve lots of more work. But I suspect that, you know, to the extent that the safe asset would also contribute to a more resilient and stable EMU, I don't think the UK would be against. Maybe some other member states would see themselves as the safe asset, would be more resisting, but I'm speculating.
Anybody else want to comment on the Brexit stuff? Juliano or Jeromin, anybody?
So I was still in government when Brexit happened, and shortly thereafter, you know, obviously, you know, everyone was shocked, and we were trying to prepare the Bratislava summit, and so the view in our ministry was we really need to get serious on reform. And so this was blocked, this view, with the argument, wait, you know, but the Brits weren't even in the euro, so clearly, you know, euro area issues can have nothing to do with reaction to Brexit. And our argument was they bloody well can have something to do with this, because the euro and the architecture of the euro is the reason for the slow growth performance of the euro area. And that slow growth performance is what has made the continent unattractive to the Brits. And so we absolutely have to put that center and front and center. And that view was rejected. And in the end, I don't think very much came out of the Bratislava summit. Now, I still think that the fundamental point is right. So the euro area is so big that the attractiveness of the European project as a whole is really tied to the performance of the euro area. What I worry about right now, and this point is made very briefly at the beginning of the report, and I agree with it, is that the recovery that's going on right now is going to take a little bit the wind out of the sails for genuine reform. And that, I think, would be a terrible mistake, because we are not out of the woods for many reasons.
I think there are probably three implications that are important to this deepening of the European Monetary Union. First, I think that the quasi-antagonistic negotiating situation over the Brexit process probably helps the center in European politics and helps unify the remainder of the European Union in a way. Of course, also the European Union converging to the European Monetary Union in terms of member states makes coordination a little easier. A second point I would say is I think that the departure of the UK probably shifts the financial integration elements of these reform plans toward sort of crisis management, debt management, a little more as opposed to toward deepening of capital markets, and I don't think that's a good development. And thirdly, I think, and perhaps most importantly, I think the Brexit does highlight the sort of tail risk of a country pulling out or deciding to leave the EU or the European Monetary Union for reasons that are not directly tied to an escalating crisis.
Yeah, just to amplify your second point, I thought there was an interesting statistic in the report. It noted that with the exit of the UK, the euro area accounts for 85% of the GDP of the total EU. So it becomes pretty close to the total. And that convergence of that type could be significant. Okay, floor is open for questions, comments, and we've got a hand mic and we've got a standing mic. Randy and then Jacob.
Thank you, Fred. I'm Randy Henning at American University. Thank you all for these comments. It was a really interesting set of presentations. Two things quickly. I really much appreciated Jeromin's kind of remarks about market discipline and the need to create mechanisms that deepen market discipline so that we can move toward decentralized fiscal discipline rather than progressively more interventionist mechanisms of enforcing rules. So I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about how your proposals can deepen and expand on market discipline. The second point is I'd be also interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about the different pathways for democratic accountability, right? This was, as was pointed out, kind of the section of the report that was perhaps the shortest. And the dilemma we face, of course, is whether we do this within the European Parliament or we do it through consultation with national parliaments and the trade-offs associated with that. Thank you.
Whichever of you prefer to address that.
Maybe I could start on the on the market discipline question. Indeed, this is one of the central elements in these proposals, in the sense that we tried in this report to have a more balanced approach between rules and institutions on one hand, and more incentives, market incentives for good fiscal and financial policies. And as Jeromin just mentioned, compared to the Five Presidents report, we mentioned a lot more market incentives here. Now, how would this work? We know that markets tend to work either in horizontal lines or in vertical lines and overreact, right? When there is some stress, they overreact. So the idea is, can we come up with a package that makes this reaction function of the market more linear, right? More gradual. And hence the idea of having this package of, okay, ending the risk-free status of sovereign debt in banks' balance sheets, yes, but preceding that with a number of steps that ensure financial stability. Full banking union and a safe asset that would replace the role that sovereign debt now plays in the financial system. And by doing that, you could achieve the objective of ending the doom loop between banks and sovereigns, because it would be pushing for greater diversification in banks' exposures. You would make market incentive for discipline, because countries would know that if they don't have the right policies in place, markets would react, right? And with the, in extremis, the possibility that your debt could be restructured, right? And so with this construction, you actually achieve this double objective. So that's how we would, in this paper, address the market discipline topic. On democratic accountability, it has always been, as the French say, le parent pauvre, the poor member of the family. In all the reports that have discussed this. The basic principle is that democratic accountability should happen at the level where decisions are taken. If they are taken at the European level, then there should be the European Parliament. If they're taken at national level, then there should be the national parliament. Mixing the two is sometimes very complicated, and can, depending on how it's done, can complicate the governance structure more than in what it is already. So there is some discussion about the involving the national parliaments, but one needs to be very careful about that.
Next question over here.
Dirk Wouters, Belgian Embassy. Thank you for bringing the report so fast to Washington and for all the comments. Now, I found the report very useful. I mean, to look back a bit and to identify also the part of the way that remains to be covered. But what I didn't really find in the report were, let's say, proposed avenues, even operational avenues, to overcome these famous political stumbling blocks that have to be overcome if you want to really implement those proposals and ideas that are indispensable to make the project really more solid and irreversible. I mean, some mention was made in last intervention by Mr. Zettelmeyer to some of the stumbling blocks, but I mean, we've been in Europe now for, I think, more than 5 or 6 or 7 years, been blocked by the stumbling blocks, and European leaders seem to be committed on paper on the deepening of economic and monetary union, but not really politically committed. And so also some work has to be done there. Of course, you can say it's not our job of the European Commission, it's the European Council, because European leaders, but could you comment a bit on really the more operational avenues that would have to be proposed, and what kind of work really needs to be done in the institution where it has to be done in order to implement some of the ideas and the proposals of the report? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I thought that one pretty effective method that plays a pretty significant role throughout, as I said, was the framing of redistribution mechanisms as insurance. I think a lot of Western countries do that in their own social programs. I think that's smart. I think it sort of smooths the path for a lot of the political ambitions that would otherwise be, I think, inconceivable.
Maybe one word on I think there is a window of opportunity that is opening now for making progress on this area. One of the reasons progress has been slow so far on this is because the Franco-German engine have basically not been working to the extent that it used to in the past, right? And there is lots of suspicion around the table. And probably now, with the elections in France, maybe we'll have, for the first time, a president of France that has been elected with a very clear European agenda, with a mandate, and who seems to have a vision, the convictions, and the energy to push this. And if he's able to restart the Franco-German engine on this, maybe this is the turning point that we were looking for. I'm sure Jeromin has
So about pretty much exactly 2 years ago, when Macron was the Minister for Economic Affairs and my then boss Sigmar Gabriele was the German Minister for Economic Affairs, we had some meetings to try and come up with a Franco-German compromise, and it wasn't too difficult. It was pretty much along the lines of this paper, and this was subsequently published in a sketchy way in a short paper that came out in a number of newspapers. Now, of course, there's a big difference with having, writing something like this if you are the chairman of the Social Democrats and the Minister for Economic Affairs on behalf of the junior partner, or doing this for the whole government. And there's also probably a difference in whether you do this as Macron, the Minister for Economic Affairs, or Macron as the President of France, right? But I think, though, that, in principle, national interests can be reconciled. And so, and I also think that, the fact that, as we now expect, Mrs. Merkel will be re-elected very easily. In a way, even though, I disagree with a number of the things she did during the euro area, and certainly in the current government, she has not been a source of imagination when it comes to euro area reform. I think there could be a Nixon can go to China effect, right? So the combination of having her and Macron in France and her in Germany to convince a reluctant German public could work. The big stumbling block is this incredible worry about unintended consequences. That's number one. And then there is another stumbling block, which is I really agree with the Commission paper in that the joint safe asset is the natural counterpart to more market discipline. You will not get this. You will not get more market discipline without a European level safe asset. But in Germany, there has been a real press campaign against this, and the notion of a common European safe asset is really a taboo. Even the Social Democrats will not mention it because it is still very much linked to the notion of mutualization. And now, Brunnermeier and his colleagues have been going on for a 4-year campaign trying to explain to everyone, look, it doesn't have to involve mutualization, and still there are huge suspicions. So that will have to get around somehow. It will require leadership, basically.
Okay, Jacob, and then back to the back. Or Angel, it was Angel.
Angel Ubide from Goldman Sachs. 2 quick questions. First one is a comment more than a question. That is, I think the insistence on convergence might not be right. Stan mentioned that from an economic standpoint, you want more diversity in economic structures. And convergence is a loaded word. Convergence towards what? Is the German model the right one? Is the US model the right one? You will simplify your life by simply increasing resilience of the European economies or something like that. It's a much, it's a better way of thinking about it, but I think it would have better properties also from an economic standpoint. The second one is about home bias. So do we know why there is home bias in the balance sheet of banks and why there is home bias in the ownership of banks, right? If we want to really have risk sharing, we need to break those 2 sources of home bias. We just had the rescue of Banco Popular in Spain. It was bought by a Spanish bank. So what can we do? First of all, why is it happening? And second, can we do anything about it? Because otherwise, without breaking that source of home bias, a lot of the things that you are presented are not going to be very effective.
Who wants that?
I take the first one. Okay, I take the one on convergence. I mean, convergence on this question on the convergence, in fact, we have not developed as much as in other areas in the reflection paper compared to the 5 presidents. And the reason is that the more we've been working on this, the more we've realized that there is a very big confusion on what convergence means. I've already managed to make a list of 7 different definitions of convergence, which are in the back of the minds when people. I will not repeat them here, but just to say it's a very, very difficult debate, in particular because the suggestion with the 5 Presidents report was to link some convergence to access to some of the new functions. So we didn't want to just put too much into this now. However, what we are doing so of course we are continuing working on this, but we have shifted a little bit the discussion to the issue which you mentioned, resilience. And in fact, we have now included there will be a Eurogroup meeting in September where we brought, on the agenda this question of resilience. And the idea here is to have resilience of economic structures so that they can be all together working and manage to deliver convergence on all the fronts, which is nominal, real, social, geographical, institutional, on many fronts. So this is very important. This, in our view, is what matters most for the proper function of EMU. What still remains, so first of all, we need to still agree on this concept, make sure that member states agree before we start the next phase of identifying which are the policies which deliver resilience. And then the next step will be, once we've done this taxonomy and identification, identify the top priorities into this field, and then make sure that there is action. There, another dimension which is very important is, once you've identified policies to be delivered, the question is, which is the level to deliver? And there we will see, we see two levels, in fact, going forward, but for both of them we need this kind of exercise, because for some policies it doesn't really matter how you deliver them, but it's important the outcome. For these ones, it's good to have a general policy recommendation to member states and therefore continuing in our approach or coordination. For others, we might find out, for example, in the insolvency area or in other areas, that it is much better to have a European action, and therefore you can take the EU level, perhaps directives or regulations, just to make sure that it is binding on everybody. But this exercise, in a way, so far we've been moving more the other way around, trying to identify some policies and just indicate, but we need to do a bit more homework. So that's why we didn't go too much in detail here. There was a second question, which was on...
Maybe on the home buyers issue. The problem is, as Jeromin said also before, despite the progress that has been done in unifying supervision, some steps on the resolution, there is still too much discretion at the national level on issues, on policies that affect the health of banks and the ownership and the cross-border ownership of banks and all this. So on issues like insolvency, accounting, plenty of things like this that on which there is still too much discretion, and there is still also too much power probably from the national supervisors, right? And the fact, for example, the latest example that you gave, that Banco Popolare was not bought by a bank, a non-Spanish bank, illustrates this.
Okay, in the back.
Hi, hello. I'm Gonzalo Garcia from the Embassy of Spain. On the safe asset, you have presented as the menu, but you haven't talked much about your tastes. And perhaps understandably, as Jeromin said. I wanted to ask you about the SBS proposal that you mentioned. I went through the document several times, just because then I heard that some reference. Can you clarify just what do you think about that proposal? If you think that's a good kind of prospect to get to the safe asset? Thank you.
Okay, first of all, it's very important, I think, referring to what Jeromin said before, I think it's very important that there is ongoing work which is going beyond the pure academic into a more institutional work, and with some impact, at least on the political side, that something now about in this area can be discussed and work can go on. So I think that's very positive. And that's why the Commission is participating in this work, which is done by the ESRB in putting together mainly supervisors and central bankers, but also other players, including more institutional ones, into this work. So it is a work still which is ongoing. It's very complicated because it brings very different dimensions into interplay. So the financial, the institutional, the debt managers' perspectives, and many others. So it's and there's a lot of political consequences because at the end it is an implication of how governments finance themselves. So it is useful to have this debate, and we are trying to push it further. In fact, there is now a group of probably more than 100 people in different subgroups who are working, and that's the first ever done. So that's very positive, and we want to support. Now, the work already has indicated that there are difficulties. It's not as nice as the presentation made in the academic papers, and there are a number of difficulties. So much that there is already several. We are, I think, 2 or 3 versions, after the original proposals to try to deal with the challenges. So I think the most important message for me is that they are authors themselves. They don't call them anymore European safe assets. They call them safe asset, or in the sense that we have realized that if we want to construct this instrument, given that it relies on transferring the risk on a junior bond, for which is very difficult at the moment to understand what the demand is, the implication is that the size of this instrument should be rather small, because there might not be such a big market. I mean, just a few days ago, somebody was telling me that they expect this to be 150 billion maximum as a market. This is very, very small compared to the initial ideas of 1.5 trillion. So in a way, there are some limitations which probably the construction will not be able to overcome, but that doesn't mean that it is not an instrument which will not serve. So we in fact support it in the process, in the sense that if you can add another class of a safe asset in Europe which allows the diversification would be welcome. And then the second element is that it will provide a lot of analytical work which might be useful for the ideas which we think might be necessary to work on anyways for reaching the truly, let's say, European one, which is big, because some analysis of the market, the functioning, the econometrics and all this, and the interaction with the market, I think will be very useful. So it's constructive, but we are aware of the difficulties.
Final question from the floor.
Thank you for the final question. My name is Jo Marie Griesgraber. I'm with New Rules for Global Finance, which is a nonprofit. And I would like to go back to the political question, because that seems to be the real stumbling block. And yet all of your proposals are, if you look at the direction of your arrow of the one chart, is from the top down. And finally you get to the politics. How can this process be reversed to start with the political issues? And I mean more than just North-South. I mean national identity versus European bureaucrats. Because I did hear, I apologize, but I did hear a lot of bureaucratic language and not a lot of popular political democratic concerns.
That's a far-reaching question.
Okay, I'll
put to the bureaucrats.
Just on this, I think on this point, I think the view, my view is actually pretty different. The exercise is very political, although this document might seem much less so. You should not forget that this is coming as a reflection paper, as a series of reflection paper, which accompany what is the white paper on the future of Europe, which has been the basis for this debate. Now, I consider our paper on the reflection paper the plumbing, of the house. So we need to identify the best way to deliver. The point is that there is a political issue. We don't know who wants to live in the house or what house we want to build. And this is exactly the debate which the white paper has launched. The Commission President has decided to go this way, exactly because we wanted to have this political debate at all levels, from the very high to the lowest level, in order then, by the end of the year, to decide how we move forward. In that context, then, once we know exactly the construction, then we will put forward the specific ideas on how to deliver.
I want to ask one final question, then we'll break for lunch. I want to give each of you 30 seconds to respond to it. Suppose I told you that you could have one, but only one, of the proposals that are laid out in the report. Which would you choose? This is my way of trying to figure out your priorities.
I would choose the completion of the banking union. I think that's definitely the most important and urgent thing that needs to be done in the short term.
Gabriele?
Yeah, I also agree with that. I mean, what we have seen is that the financial cycles are amplifying shocks, and the convergence and divergence, and and the political implications of it. So we need to go into that, and that's why we devoted a large part of our work on this.
Stan?
I would force the member nations to build up significant rainy day funds.
Combination of European safe asset and change in regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures, which is a subset of the banking union.
Yeah.
Okay, many thanks to all four of you. You got us a terrific start. We'll break for lunch. Everybody go to the buffet. We'll start again in about 15 minutes. Bring your food back to your table, and we'll go to the second panel at 12:30. Thanks. Attention, and we will resume the program while you continue eating. As I mentioned this morning, the second part of today's conference, in response to a request from our friends at the Commission, was to do some in-depth research here at the Institute on possible lessons from the U.S. experience for the European integration process in the areas of fiscal policy and fiscal consolidation, in the areas of banking union, in the areas of regional transmission of shocks and economic outcomes. And so what we have this afternoon is 3 presentations on those topics. And I think you will find them fascinating. They suggest in a way that what everybody is asking Europeans to do is actually on a very tight schedule if you compare it with the time over which the United States moved to anything resembling banking union, consolidated fiscal policy, et cetera, et cetera. Europe is being asked to move at lightning speed. And so we're often frustrated when it doesn't happen so fast, but the U.S. experience will give at least a little more understanding as to why it may take a while. Our first presentation will be by Jacob Kirkegaard, Danish by nationality, but has been here at the Institute now for 15 years, working on a wide range of both national and functional topics. Jacob has worked extensively with me, but on his own much more so, on the European crisis, the Euro problems of the last 7 to 8 years in particular, but has also written widely on pension reform, labor markets, and a wide range of functional issues. His paper is on the U.S. fiscal integration experience and how it may generate some lessons for Europe. Jacob will lead off. Then we turn to Anna Gelpern, who's a non-resident senior fellow here. She's a professor of law at Georgetown, a great expert on financial integration, government debt, regulation. She co-authored the leading law textbook on international finance. She has spent time at the Treasury Department. She's been an expert for the UNCTAD and other international institutions, and she will present a paper on the U.S. banking union experience and how it relates to the European difficulties. Finally, third and finally, Jeremie Cohen-Setton, a research fellow here at the Institute since last September. He finished his PhD recently at Berkeley, works on monetary and fiscal policy, structural reforms, etc. Jeremie comes from Europe. He worked at Bruegel, at the British Treasury, and his work is on the regional transmission of economic shocks, dislocations, and what that experience in the U.S. context might mean for Europe. So, Jacob, Anna, Jeremie in that order, and then again, they will take the platform for Q&A with the audience. Jacob.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. It's certainly a pleasure to be back and talking about these issues, because I think, you know, if we look at it realistically at the political landscape, and I think José mentioned that at the end of that panel, there really is an opportunity, I would argue now, to move forward. The stars have become more aligned, so to speak. And I would also like to thank the Commission for supporting the work we've done or are doing on this work. As Fred said, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of fiscal integration experience in the United States and give a few sort of overarching lessons, and then focus on one specific proposal or lesson, if you like. And it's a lesson that I think, echoing perhaps slightly the last question of the previous panel, which is that it may be a bureaucratic exercise, but it's one of those bureaucratic exercises that I think will actually prove quite helpful in overcoming some of the political opposition to fiscal integration. And certainly I'm going to argue that this has been its function here in the United States. So firstly, as I said, a few lessons from U.S. fiscal history. Then talk a little bit about, okay, well, we talk about fiscal integration or financial centralization, fiscal centralization, a central budget as sort of an a priori good thing, but what do we mean by that? And then, as I said, I want to propose to you, and as I've done previous from this podium, that I really want to, I think that looking specifically at the use of earmarked funding mechanisms that are widely used here in the United States is really a very good way to try to overcome some of these political hostilities. And if you're thinking about how do we get to a bigger and politically more sustainable EU budget, this is in the direction that I think the European Union, the Euro area, etc., could sensibly go. So when I started thinking about this, having read a bunch of stuff about America's fiscal union, I kept being reminded about this quote that we always use when we talk about, the formation of European integration, that, as Jean Monnet used to say, it will be forged in crisis and the sum of those solutions adopted. And I thought, you know what? If Jean Monnet had been, John Monnet and was a fictitious founding father of the United States, he would actually, you could make quite a lot of the same argument. Because if you look at the formation of the American fiscal union, it is very much a story of movement forward, integrationist tendencies at times of crisis. And not least, in the construction of these types of institutions, the federal government in the United States had one big advantage, if you like. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it is responsible, or has historically been responsible, for waging wars. And that, as I will show, has really mattered. And the fact that the European Commission obviously doesn't have, indeed was created to prevent those kinds of things from happening, does make this more difficult. But I think it's also important to really internalize this point that actually construction of the US fiscal union took a very long time. Because there is often this, I think, misguided sentiment that, well, it was all settled, at this initial Hamiltonian moment when the debt was consolidated, etc. But what we will see is that yes, it was consolidated, but that didn't mean you had a fiscal union that really did much. And I think this, from a European perspective, is actually particularly important because Europeans tend to often, or the European debate on this, looking at the US experience, tends to overly focuses on this sort of Hamiltonian moment because it obviously is what led to the sort of, when we're talking about Eurobonds, and if you think that Eurobonds is the only way forward for the European fiscal integration, yes, you're right to focus on Hamilton, but also in the sort of broader political context in Europe, you're barking up the wrong tree. And I think you're overlooking, therefore, a lot of these sort of more incremental innovations or institutions that have been implemented here in the United States over many, many years. You basically, and that's really where I think the real lessons for the Europeans, or the Euro area in particular, are at this moment. So just highlighting this, I mean, the best way, obviously, to do this, to make this clear, I would certainly argue, is, to basically look at this is the size of the expenditures. And, if you strip out wars and the cost of debt, which you sensibly should do, in my opinion, because the European Commission doesn't wage wars and it doesn't have any debt to service by definition. It took 130 years for the federal budget to exceed the roughly 1.2% of GDP that is the European Commission's budget today. 130 years. And yes, you may say, okay, fine, it was a different era back then. It wasn't, the modern welfare states and the sort of Keynesian notion of fiscal policy and all that. But I would argue that what it tells you is that the bigger political movements, this shifting of national identities, the formation of a community that allows large amounts of resources for being pooled at another level of government. Well, in the US, as I said, it took 130 years to get to that. And you know, when Fred said that that Europe is being asked to move at lightning speed, well, absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. So therefore, this early US experience actually does have, in my opinion, an important lesson there, that it takes a lot of time. And we shouldn't, in fact, when we're talking about constructing these types of institutions in a European context, be afraid or ashamed, or whatever you want to call it, of using crisis to move forward. Because that is, I would argue, another central lesson from US history. You know, don't waste a good crisis, quote unquote. So if you look at the early, this is the level of debt at the federal level going back to 1790 to 1860. There are two main messages from this chart. Well, first of all, the shaded areas are the two main wars of the first 70 years of the United States: the 1812 war against Britain, and then the war against Mexico in the mid-1840s. And you will see that they, you know, if you look at the big jumps in debt, you know, it comes from war. It doesn't come from any sort of counter-cyclical anything during the various panics of the economy during this era. And the other, so this was really, it was about fighting wars. It wasn't about, you know, fiscal stabilization or convergence or anything like that. Which means that the early sort of foundation, again, these are tools that the Commission thankfully doesn't have. The other thing that is, I think, frequently misunderstood is this is, if you have to compare the height of the bars and the height of, so to speak, of the line. The line being the federal debt, and the height of the bars being those years in which, at least I was able to find, shall we say, relatively trustworthy numbers for total amounts of outstanding state and municipal debt. And what you will see is actually that you know, the level of state and municipal outstanding debt in these early years was far, far higher than that of outstanding federal debt. So the fiscal integration of the Hamiltonian moment, so to speak, this idea that all debt was consolidated onto the federal balance sheet, is wrong. That wasn't the case. The dominance in the debt sense of the federal government came much later. This essentially takes it forward to the 1940s. And again, you can see the Civil War, and then, of course, the World War I is accountable for the very significant, now these are gross data, so there is an inflation issue there as well, but doesn't change the broader fact that you got to go all the way to the Great Depression and the New Deal to find non-war related significant increases in federal debt. And even in 1932, if you add up outstanding at that time, if you add up outstanding state and municipal, state and local government debt, it actually exceeded the level of federal debt. So again, the fiscal dominance in the debt sense came much, much later. And that really, I believe, is a fairly important lesson to take from US fiscal history. So what do we actually want from, turning to the second line, what do we want from a centralized budget in a more normative sense? Well, obviously, as the ambassador said from the beginning, well, we would like to have some sort of convergence, but this is really hard to do in a centralized budget. It would have to be enormously big, and even if it was very big, it's doubtful that it would actually work in the long run, in my opinion. Then you would have to have some sort of counter-cyclical buffer, which obviously is an inherent part of the paper that we talked about in the first panel. And then I would argue that you really want to have a capacity to solve those policy areas that really should be done so best at the regional level. This is sort of the inverse result of the subsidiarity principle, the subsidiarity principle will dictate that there really are things that you should sensibly do at the regional level. And as a result, you should therefore, of course, also fund them. I don't have time to go into the finer details of this, but just want to make clear that obviously what is best solved at the regional level is in the eye of the beholder, of course, in many ways, but it's also very clearly something that changes over time. There is never a fixed notion of states' rights in the United States. This is something that evolves very dramatically over time. And same thing I would argue in Europe. I mean, you cannot sensibly, certainly in my opinion, argue that recent events on the borders of Europe doesn't mean that right now an common external border control is absolutely something that should be done at the regional level, which perhaps it wasn't back in the mid-1980s when the Schengen area was first thought up. So these things change. And then the question is, how do you do it? Well, certainly, if you look at today's EU budget, this is not going to be the right element or the right starting. Well, it's a starting point, obviously, but it's not the right tool with which to achieve the majority of the goals that I just showed. Partly because it's really, I don't want to go into too many details, but just to say that this budget is very large for a multilateral organization. It's by far the largest of any organization in the world, which is, of course, commensurate with the tasks that the Commission has. But most of it comes from direct transfers from member states. There's actually very little of it, and that's the green and the yellow bars there that could essentially be said to be European revenue. What does that mean? What it means that you actually do in Europe now, every 7 years you have a budget discussion, and there is this focus on what is the net contribution rates of each individual member state. Because we're talking about direct transfers here. And I would actually argue that this is, again, coming back to the lessons from the US fiscal history. This is quite similar to the debate you had in the US prior to the 16th Amendment, when you had this so-called apportionment clause in the US Constitution, which basically dictated that you could only raise taxes in proportion to the number of people that lived in each state. Which basically meant you couldn't do a progressive income tax or anything like that. So it was all about the relative taxes of individual states, which is where Europe is now. So, one of the things that it took for the US to move beyond that state of affairs was a change in the Constitution. In the same way that obviously, as José said, look, we got to change the treaty if we really want to get to get beyond this. So, is this? This just tells you a little bit about the institutional problems that we face, which again the U.S. historically also faced, because changing the 16th Amendment didn't pass the first time they tried. It took quite a long time to do so. So then there is this other issue that even if you did have the legal possibility to do direct taxes at the European level, I would argue that it simply won't happen for the foreseeable future, because people don't self-identify as Europeans. They continue to identify predominantly as Greeks, French, Germans, etc. And what that means is that they will only, in my opinion, be taxed at that level of government. And what this chart shows you is that actually this is true for pretty much all European countries, but more importantly, the right-hand side, it's pretty stable over time. So 25 years of EMU and other things haven't actually changed much of this. And that poses a very significant problem. Fortunately, however, it's probably a problem that, at least I would argue, some of the tools that are used in the United States may be able to address. And this is essentially through the use of earmarked revenue. Because what is earmarked revenue? Earmarked revenue is essentially you have one service that you provide at a given level of government that is funded by one specific tax or fee or whatever we choose to call it. And in the US, in some ways, you have the inverse issue that you have in the in the Europe, where most of the national identity, I would argue, is clearly at the federal or central level, and it's therefore the state governments that face this problem. So what this chart here shows you here is, well, how do they fund themselves? State government in the US are accountable for about 40% of total general government expenditures. And that's a bit of a paradox if I'm right that they basically retain a much smaller fraction of, shall we say, the identities of people. But one of the ways they do it is that they rely on a lot of these earmarked revenues. And I would say that that's one of the ways in which a level of government is able to command resources, even if the identities of their taxpayers may not be there. So when we're talking about some of the proposals actually that are in this, in the Commission's reflection paper, I mean, an investment insurance scheme, I think it's a good idea. I think the unemployment reinsurance scheme is a good idea. But when I think about how should I fund those, well, I think you should fund them by some sort of earmarked levy. That means that this revenue goes specifically to these tasks and not be part of a sort of bureaucratic backdoor, backroom wheeling and dealing. So this tool, if you like, of earmarked revenue, I would argue, as I said in the beginning, is a bureaucratic process that helps you overcome political resistance to pooling resources at, in the case of Europe, a higher level of government. I would argue that it's probably therefore also more democratic and therefore politically sustainable than the current process. And how do we think about it? You can do it in many ways. You can have explicit fees, obviously user fees. That takes care of it, right? The polluter pays. That's how you funded the banking union, for instance. That's how Europe is going to start taxing foreigners pretty soon in the, say, when visa waiver partners have to pay for that. You can have fees on related items. The Highway Trust Fund is funded by a fuel tax. That kind of makes sense. It's not direct user, it's not road pricing, but it's kind of close. Having climate mitigation measures at the European level funded through either ETS revenues or a European version of the latest American proposal for carbon dividends, those types of things, I think you should do. Or you could go even further and you can say, well, we have a broad category here, and it's I just give you an example. The common agricultural policy, well, I would say, well, if you want to have a common agricultural policy and you want to spend $50 billion a year on it, fund it through an earmarked value added on food items. That would be very regressive in a way, so I'm not necessarily advocating it, but just to show you that this is a tool that is quite flexible. And since I'm way out of time now, let me conclude and just say that the key lesson, I would argue, from the U.S. fiscal history is it takes a long time. The speed at which we're being asked to move in Europe is really, really high. And you need crisis to do it. And Europe doesn't have the same kind of crises, AKA war emergencies, than the US did. I think the financing through earmarked revenue is actually a flexible and promising way to overcome some of the political resistance to more regional level resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am very grateful for the opportunity to think about the U.S. banking system and the U.S. banking journey through the prism of the banking union. It's been a really fun project, and I'm sorry that my partner in crime, the European half of this, is not here, but one of the more interesting debates we've had is, well, what exactly is a banking union, and do we actually have it? So I think that one way to talk about this is as a work in progress about a work in progress. One of the things you're going to hear is basically just repeating what Jacob said, which is that it took a really long time. When I saw in the presentation this morning the agenda for 2017 to 2019, I thought, well, that's kind of nice because, it took us 200 years. If you can do it in 2, more power to you. So the other really interesting question that came to me this morning was this emphasis on sequencing, because our takeaway so far is that not that sequencing doesn't matter, but that there's really no God-given sequence for building a banking union, nor is the pace of the evolution something that you could predict or manage very well. I think it's really about constant evolution, adaptation, shocks, realignment, and political reactions and political realignments, which take a long time. On the doom loop question, it is incredible to what extent state finances were tied up with banking in the United States. There was no ambiguity about it. Nobody was hiding the ball. There were no acronyms. I mean, basically, banks were there to finance the governments, period. And various people associated with the government, and that was just stunning. So what's interesting is to see, well, what exactly changed, why, and how? And that's something we're still working on. Finally, and this is totally obvious, but bears emphasis, banking union is a political project. And so, yes, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and this is, in some sense, about taking political advantage of crises. However, there are downsides to crisis response and to reform via crisis response, and I'll touch on that. And one of the side effects of creating a banking union through constant crisis response is this lingering vulnerability to wholesale reversals, of which we have seen quite a few. This is just to emphasize the point that we didn't evolve the same way as Europe at all. So we start with a political union, the Constitution, and a bit of a fiscal union with the national debt. But as Jacob said, we shouldn't put too much emphasis on that because it was a very, very, very partial fiscal union at best. We then this is the Hamiltonian moment, and actually a cautionary tale. We try to have a central bank and federal banking, and those big technocratic projects come crashing down in a really bad way. We then have the Civil War, and which I think is very much a political union moment. It struck me the extent to which we were talking about European identity. I mean, this is really, and this is very much pop history, but historians do look to the Civil War as a national identity moment, right? And the United States plural becomes the United States singular is very much dates to the 1860s. This is also where you have something called the National Banking Act, which sure sounds like a banking union. It really wasn't. It was a bit of a monetary union, and not a very robust one at that. We do have the start of national banking supervision then. We finally get a central bank same year as we get the national income tax, the federal income tax. We then get the Great Depression and a great leap forward, sort of, right? Because you do get deposit insurance, you do get more centralization both in the governance of the Fed and some additional lender of last resort powers. But you also have functional segmentation and almost a reinforcement of the geographic fragmentation in the banking industry. After World War II, again, there should be another asterisk there because on the one hand, you do have federal regulation, consolidation of federal oversight over bank holding companies. On the other hand, as part of the bargain, there are restrictions on interstate branching, right? So the Bank Holding Company Act, on the one hand, says all bank holding companies are supervised by the Fed. On the other hand, partly it was a reaction to one holding company getting clever and having banks in a whole bunch of states when states weren't going to let it do that, right? So the dual banking system continues. And is in some ways reinforced in 56. Finally, 94, 99, you get sort of the beginning of the end of geographic restrictions, partly in response to arbitrage that's going on, and then Gramm-Leach-Bliley and the dismantling of functional boundaries. It's striking that in the early 1990s, only 7 banking organizations had commercial banking presence in 10 states. Right? I mean, we really did not have much of a banking union in the early 1990s. We had a fiscal union, we had a political union, we had a monetary union. We really didn't have much. So, good luck with that 2-year frame. So as not to overblow the comparisons, right? None of us starts at a magic, clean slate zero moment. So, the U.S., we've seen this evolving political compromise. Part of it is dual chartering. From the very beginning, we had federally chartered banks and state chartered banks. In the beginning, federally chartered banks, even actually before the Constitution, we had one that was chartered by the Continental Congress, and it was like half owned by the Founding Fathers. It was, did some business for the government, the usual thing. Federally chartered. Pennsylvania didn't like it. Basically, they got pushed to recharter as a state bank. But this just tells you that we've had this competitive relationship between state and federal chartering and supervision authorities going back all the way to the founding days. And this has been, evolving. It's sort of been getting more peaceful, but that's very much a feature of our regime that you don't have federal chartering in Europe, really, which is something that I think it's a fundamental distinction that's worth thinking about. The really important thing, and that is becoming sort of huge in my mind, kind of grows and grows and grows as, Nicola is away. But the fact that we had no monetary union really until the 20th century is huge, right? Because basically our banking policy is all about currency scarcity and states trying to print money and banks trying to print money and everybody buying off their own authorities in order to do their thing. You had rampant counterfeiting. You had these giant books that told merchants how much to take off the state banknotes from far away versus nearby. I mean, we did not have the euros, so this really should be seen as an important motivator for a lot of the banking actions. I already mentioned, we had not only restrictions on interstate banking, we had restrictions on banking on branching within a state. We had in many states, most states for a while, certainly up north, you had banks that had one branch, maybe 2 branches. Right? In the South, you had more branching, but it's really very much part of our history. In addition, we had no universal banking, and if anything, that tradition has stuck. So activities and affiliation restrictions have been with us for a very long time, and partly, of course, it's a political economy issue, right? You sort of send your banks where you want their money, and you pull them back. It's very much a political kind of bargaining process, but that results in a lot of fragmentation of supervision, fragmentation of charters. You have some of this in Europe, but it's certainly very pronounced in the United States. All right, so now to bank sovereign links. This is very much a story of capture and competition. So we had certainly states owning banks and living off the dividends. We have taxation, and of course, I already mentioned the founding fathers were big into bank ownership early on. Taxation, this goes back to the monetary union point. Taxation of state banknotes was huge. I mean, there was, in some New England states, bank taxes were more than half the state revenues, right? So this was not a small, subtle, hard to figure out point. This is pretty much front and center in our history. Chartering conditions. So there were, early on, every bank charter, for example, in New York, required a special act of the New York State Legislature. What do you think happened? You know, each one was a bargain. Then we had something called free banking, which is the biggest misnomer ever, because all that meant was that you didn't get a special act of the legislature for each bank. You just had the legislature announcing their requirements, and then there was an administrative process. But the administrative process, licensing was very much fraught with quid pro quos. You had to buy, in different states, you had to hold different amounts of state debt in order to have a charter or finance favored projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keep reserves with state authorities. Let's see, there's special mandates basically for performing government services. That was certainly another link. Credit policy is a fascinating one. So you would have, and this is very much a story of the two banks of the United States, the first and the second. The second in particular tried to be really clever and control credit in different parts of the country by buying up state banknotes and then presenting them for redemption all at once, right? So if a bank printed too many banknotes and didn't have enough specie, that was a problem. And that's one of the reasons that fed political opposition, of course, to federal banks, and particularly to Second Bank of the United States, and contributed to its demise. Deposit insurance was not born in 1933-34. New York State had an insurance scheme 100 years earlier. There were state funds. That, of course, was another occasion to get banks to buy government debt. There were mutual schemes long before federal insurance came along. There was also a lender of last resort function before the Fed with state-owned and private clearinghouses. Finally, again, there was state supervision as part of the chartering in the 19th century, and that varied quite a bit. The OCC was created under the National Banking Act, so in the mid-Civil War, and that really was the beginning of national supervision that was funded, professionalized, and even written up in some fiction at the time. So the National Bank Examiners became pretty big. All right, so this one's for a special Peterson Institute slide. It's a quote from a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in 1910. This is, almost 50 years into the National Banking Charter, and this is in the run-up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. About 80% of federal debt is held by national banks, right? So at the time, what you have is national banks, federally chartered banks and state chartered banks are just sort of both, each is financing their own government, right? So there's nothing bad about that, except that, this former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, I'm out of time, says that this is kind of a monetary policy problem, right? And we should really have a central bank, which we get a few years later. All right. So this is the part that we're struggling with, right? How did it change so that in 1910, national banks accounted for 80% of US Treasury holders? Now all banks are about, oh, good, thank you. All banks are about like 4%, right? So how did it go from 80 to 4? You know, I think it's reasonable to ask whether the ratcheting up of the maturation of the monetary union and the fiscal union took the pressure off the banks, right, to be that monetary and fiscal engine and sort of the go-to place for state funding. We, of course, did have national deposit insurance. We had more geographic diversification. One interesting thing to investigate with deposit insurance is it really about the insurance, or is it that even state chartered banks are now federally supervised because they're federally insured, right? There's an interesting element in the savings and loan crisis, you know, where you have state chartered thrifts and federally chartered thrifts, but everybody has access to the Federal Reserve, liquidity, right? So there's there's supervisory leverage that comes from access to the federal safety net that may play an important role. All right, so this is really like tying it up. This is a political process. This is very much the timeline you saw on one of the early slides, but look at, let's see, I don't know if this works. So early on, you pretty much have big banking reform immediately on the heels of a big war, right? I mean, it's almost, you know, it's Revolutionary War. You've got, you know, banking as a response. The first Bank of the United States, the charter expires 1811. You have a war in 1812. Madison changes his mind. You get a second Bank of the United States in 1813, right? You get the Civil War. You get the National Banking Act. And in between, you have these giant big reversals, right? So the second bank lapses, and you know, you're back to square one when it comes to central banking and national banking. Again, you know, free banking comes back with a vengeance even after the National Banking Act. So this is very much fraught with reversals. What's interesting is in the 20th century, this link between big war and big banking reform isn't as clear to see with the naked eye, right? So there are other things going on. And this is the takeaway, I think, on crisis. Obviously, a lot of our banking union advances, directly responded to crises. They present big opportunities for reform. But the problem is, in a crisis, your big priority is to solve the problem today. Right, so the Civil War, the National Banking Act, the idea was you needed to fund the war, right, and preserve the political union. You needed a monetary union, and you know, whatever you needed to do in the banking space to get there, you would do. As a result, you not only preserve, you nurture the constituency that then comes back and pushes back and holds the seeds of the reversal. Moreover, you know, the state banks again come back in a big way after the Civil War, and then everybody tries to tax one another out of existence and compete on regulation and all that. So that's a downside of policymaking by crisis. Moreover, big technocratic centralization projects that do not pay off little constituencies here and there are just fat targets, right? So there's a lot of vulnerability there. So U.S. banking union took forever. There's no magic sequence, but there's a certain hydraulic quality if you have no monetary union, more pressure on banks, right? If you have a robust fiscal union, you have more to play with in the banking space. Interestingly enough, regulatory treatment is really not so much of an issue, right? You know, we give zero risk weight to U.S. government debt and 20% to municipal debt. That's not a big driver of our arrangement, but that's us, right? The doom loop was very much a feature of the 19th century, kind of goes away in the 20th. Interesting to see why, and watch out for reversals. So, thank you.
Thank you. So this is joint work with my colleague Igor Gornostai, and this is a paper about the synchronization of US regional cycles with new data covering a new time period. So we hope we're going to bring some interesting element to the debate. So the starting point is, and we've heard that in the reflection paper of the European Commission, is obviously the importance of synchronized business cycles for well-functioning currency union. Now there is a large literature on the synchronization of business cycles across economies in the world and how this has evolved over the years. There's a lot of emphasis on the role of trade and financial integration for more or less synchronization. And there is also some work, there was also a lot of work in the 90s in particular comparing the synchronization levels of US regions with the synchronization levels of different countries that would enter into the euro. Now, in terms of the factors that we've discussed today, the deepening of the fiscal union, so more regional transfers over time, the introduction of deposit insurance, the fact that holdings of banks becomes less geographically concentrated. This literature doesn't have much to say about that. And I think, well, our starting point is that a big reason for that is because of a lack of data. It's really hard to study regional cycles for a period that is long enough that you would have actually some changes in those factors. And so that's where we try to provide something new. So I'm going to talk about this data. I'm going to talk then about a simple synchronization index that we construct to summarize how regional cycles have evolved over time. And then I'm going to talk about possible drivers. The part on possible drivers is still work in progress. So we're going to use data on retail sales by Federal Reserve districts. So when the Fed was created in 1913, in the Federal Reserve Act, it says that there should be the creation of 8 to 12 Federal Reserve banks covering the US territory. Eventually, 12 Federal Reserve banks were created. And so very early on, there is this desire to know what are the drivers of economic activity in those different parts of the country. So in 1919, the Fed began, in particular, tabulating data on retail sales by Federal Reserve districts. Now, our starting point is a paper by Hailing Park and Gary Richardson, an NBER paper of 2010. They were basically the first to recollect basically this data on retail sales for the interwar period, so from 1919 to 1939. There's been a lot of interest to document economic activity at the level of the different Federal Reserve districts, in particular because the policies of the Federal Reserve banks were not uniform across that time period. And so there was a lot of interest to have some economic data in order to measure the impact of those policies. Now, what we do is we basically extend their data collection efforts and manage to so far collect data from 1919 to 1962. And so the starting point is this is from the paper of Park and Richardson. And I think my takeaway of the paper, so this is monthly data at the Federal Reserve District level. So here it shows the growth of retail sales for the Federal Reserve District of San Francisco. And I think, so my takeaway from this is that you have a lot of high frequency variation in this data, that you have a lot of noise that basically needs to be removed. But once you remove that, and this is their black line, you get an index that seems to be a pretty good proxy of what's happening in the U.S. economy. It doesn't have, by the way, to be a perfect proxy of total economic activity. It seems to be a decent proxy. For example, if you look at the NBER turning points, you do see that economic activity starts to decline at the beginning of most of those NBER cycles, and then increases at the end of those NBER recessions. So this is we find basically we read the Federal Reserve bulletins for a lot of years, and basically managed to go beyond what these authors have done and to collect data for 1919 to 1962. In 1962 or 3, around that time, the collection of that data and the processing of that data is then transferred to another agency, the census. And so then the data is still there. So we could, with some work, reconstruct the data until today. It's slightly more difficult because then the regions are not defined the same. So we would have to make it continuous until today. We would have to, from that data, reconstruct, retail sale indices for each Federal Reserve District. Now, so as I said, there is some noise in the data that we want to remove, and then there are some, medium, long-term trends that we're not so much interested in because we want to look at the synchronization of regional cycle at business cycle frequency, right? So that's what we do here. We remove that noise, we remove the long-term trends, and then we express things in terms of regional sales, retail sale gap, basically. Now, I think there are two things to say about this graph. The first is that, okay, at least for the period, for the interval period, for example, that I know a little bit better, the movements seem to make sense. And the second thing to notice is that it does seem that the overall variance of the data is decreasing over time. Okay. Now this is potentially problematic because we're going to look at an index of how things are synchronized. Okay, but if the amplitude of the movements are decreasing, if the volatility is decreasing, that's going to bias our measure. Okay, so we're going to want to basically have an index of synchronization that corrects for changes in volatility over time. So fortunately, there is a recent paper by Kirkegaard that does exactly this, making the point that the previous papers that have tried to document year-by-year synchronization often fail to control for changes in volatility. And so he suggests an indicator that corrects for that, and then see how this changes the results in the literature. So we're going to take that index. And so basically what we have to do is first identify breaks in volatility and then basically normalize our measure of the regional output gap, you can call that, or retail sales gap. And then calculate how it moves with the measure for the U.S. as a whole. Okay. So that's what we do, and that's the result that we get. And so there are a couple of things to point out in this figure. The first one is that the gray bars again are NBR recessions. So you see that the synchronization index jumps at the start of every, if not all, recessions. The second thing to note is that basically you have a huge increase of synchronization at the start of the Great Depression. And then basically you have some movements, later on, but overall it stays high. Okay, so there does seem to be a really huge change happening at around the Great Recession, the Great Depression, sorry. And now that aligns with the narrative that a lot of the institutional features that we can think of to increase risk sharing actually happen at that time, right? Remember that before the 1930s, we certainly don't have a fiscal union. We don't have deposit insurance. So there are a lot of elements in the 1920s actually that make the U.S. economy more similar to the Eurozone today than the U.S. today. So we think this is interesting, and this is a new finding. What Anna mentioned about various changes at different time, during the post-war period about elements of the banking union makes me think that we should actually, collect data, extend potentially that data further in order to basically see, for example, if this index increased following changes about, regulations about branching and changes in the holdings of banks, or whether it was mostly the deposit insurance that actually mattered, which seemed to be suggested by this figure. Now, so I started my talk saying, okay, this index seems to be an okay proxy for economic activity. Now, the case that I have to make is that it's not only an okay proxy for economic activity, but it's also a good proxy for synchronization, for the synchronization of cycles across regions. Now, the way we can do that is basically look at periods where we have, this index and another index at the regional level, and compare, what the evolution of the synchronization index for those two series. Okay, so this here could only be done for 6 years. But that could be extended and we will extend that, but this will require more work. It was done for 6 years because we have the retail sale data disaggregated at the metropolitan statistical area level, so the regional level that the BLS uses from 1986 to 1996 in an Excel spreadsheet. And then if you want to get unemployment rates by MSAs, you can also get that pretty easily from 1990 to today. And so the overlapping period is just 1990 to 1996. Now, what's somewhat reassuring here is that it does seem that, yes, they're not overlapping exactly, and you wouldn't expect that, but there does seem to be similar movements in those synchronization index. So here, interestingly, there is a decrease in synchronization in the recession that started in the early 1990s. And then you have an increase. And what you can see is that it seems that the synchronization leads a little bit the synchronization index for unemployment rates, but overall they seem to tell the same story, which we find reassuring. Now, turning to the interesting bit, but also the part that is actually harder, is what are the possible drivers for these changes in synchronizations? So there are some channels that we can explore. Okay, so changes in sectoral structures of the different regions. Presumably, if sectoral shocks are important, if the structure become more similar over time, with the industrialization of the South, for example, then the cycles are going to be more correlated across regions. So that we haven't done the work of documenting it, but we can document that. The different types of shock, that's harder. Then another category of explanations is that the adjustment mechanisms to deal with asymmetric regional shocks have become better over time. So the wage price flexibility, it's unlikely to be the case, because I think over that time period, actually, wages become more rigid rather than more flexible. But it's actually hard to even document and implement. On migration, I think we could do we could provide some insight into that by looking at migration flows across those different regions. And then the third category is, of course, risk sharing, right? So as there have been an increase in the transfers of income from regions that are doing well to regions that are not doing well. Now, here, I think we bring a new set of data that is, I think, quite interesting, which is, and that uses the fact that the Federal Reserve banks are actually the fiscal agents of the Treasury, okay? And as such, you can basically reconstruct, how much, net, Treasury payments are done within a Federal Reserve district. And so there was a lot of work on this question at the Federal Reserve in the 1950s, and that led to the publication that led to a PhD thesis that was published in 1961 that really, documents, among other things, those Treasury transactions for the period 1945-1959. So we exploit that data and basically want to see if, and obviously this methodology could be expanded, back and also forward, because this is just using, the balance sheet of each Federal Reserve banks and looking at the Treasury account, the Treasury's general account on that balance sheet, how it changes over time, and then doing some minor corrections. But the idea then is that then we can relate our synchronization index for a region and see if the synchronization index increases when the region receives countercyclical transfers. Okay, so this is the beta that we're interested in estimating. So let's say the 12th district is doing worse than the rest of the US, so the sign of the difference will be negative. And if it receives net positive transfers, we would expect the beta sign to be negative, right? So that the product would increase the synchronization index. So far, this is preliminary, but this is indeed something that we find in the data. So we're going to explore that further. So the conclusion is so far is mostly about basically the 1930s being really a defining moment for regional synchronization. Then in terms of the drivers, there is definitely more work to be done to separate those potential drivers, but it's also a time period where you have a lot of changes in the risk sharing institutions. So that that's a plausible story. Thank you.
To start off, I wanted to ask Jacob one question. You talked a lot about the interaction between state budgets and federal budgets. And in Europe, they have a lot of very public debate about the UK rebate and who puts in and who gains and all that. We don't have that. Have we stopped publishing the data, or is it just nobody pays attention to it? And if so, maybe a lesson for the Europeans is stop publishing national data. If you could get away with it, you could stop the debate about who gains and who loses if you just eliminate the database. How about that?
Well, to a certain extent, we have stopped doing it because we used to, the Census Bureau used to publish this annual report called the Flow of Funds, the federal government flow of funds, which actually netted out fiscal transfers from the federal budget by state. That hasn't been updated since 2010. So we have, in a sense, stopped doing it. Now, what has happened is that, surprise, surprise, some of the state governments have tried to replicate this. And the state government that is probably historically most notorious for doing this is New York State, with Senator, now I forgot his name.
Schumer?
No, the one that Steve Weisman always writes about.
D'Amato.
Sorry?
D'Amato.
No. Bingo. Moynihan was obviously he came up with this concept, and the New York State Comptroller actually did this for data for 2013, which shows quite significant transfers. Out of New York, but unsurprisingly, the District of Columbia receives something of the tune of 35% of its GDP in net transfers from the federal government. But the important thing from this actually is that the federal budget in itself is not particularly countercyclical, actually. A lot of the transfers that you have is structural in nature. Because it's derived from, where are military bases located, things like that, federal government institutions, and then because the federal tax code that funds Social Security, et cetera, is very progressive. A lot of this is actually driven by average income levels in states. The data is there, but it's certainly less available than it was previously.
Okay, floor is open for questions. Yeah, Joe Marie? Go back to the mic.
I wanted to follow up with Anna about the regionalization of our banking system, and namely the fact that we have 12 Federal Reserve banks, and that seems to perpetuate the decentralization or maybe the fear of big government that is characteristic of our history. Does that make sense to you, and do the 12 regional feds really make a big difference?
That's a big question. I think the way I would want to turn this question a bit, Jeromin, and thank you for it, is that look at our first two attempts at a central bank. Right? There were no regions, there were no giveaways to regional constituencies. There was not much of a deliberate, delicate balancing of public and private regional participation. Right? And they went up in flames. There are complicated reasons. I don't think that you should, we should read too much into it. But by the time we have the first founding of the founding of the Federal Reserve, it's a very delicately, surgical compromise that gives everybody a little bit of something. Right? And then what you have in the 30s is more centralization, right? So you have the Board of Governors, the power of the regional feds actually goes down. You have the Open Market Committee. So one way to look at it is that we have had incremental centralization, but there is, but the political room was just not there to have anything other than what we have. But that's, I'm not a Fed historian. That would sort of be my.
You can have an offline conversation with your neighbor there, Mr. Truman, who could undoubtedly answer that as he can any question on the Fed. Gabriele.
Yes, first of all, a comment we were discussing briefly about before when we were sitting here about the relevance actually of Brexit also for the debate which we have in Europe about returning my money, give me my money back. So the thing is, after Brexit, would this change? That's a question for you. What do you think will happen, or is just by now entrenched and just stopping publication?
The rebates will.
Sorry?
Yeah, the budget rebates will.
Yeah, yes. Then I have a question for Jeremy, looking also at the other study which you made with Janine, and just try to understand, and also Anna perhaps has a view on this. I mean, try to understand why you see the shift in the mid-30s into the correlation, let's say, or the of the business cycles. I mean, there's something which I keep coming back to this point because I think it might be telling us something for Europe. The fact that you see from the other study, the fact that the lending rates to non-financial corporations, if I'm not wrong, into the states is quite uncorrelated, let's say, quite diverse until the Banking Act of 1935, and then it becomes very similar. Now, do you think that this has an effect on retail sales, which is seems to be perhaps something which is coming from the other study I'm making now, this analysis? And second, the other point, which for me is very important, is to see whether we can see something from this development into what might happen in Europe if this, which is basically is the collateral used by the financial system, which is the papers of the different federal banks, has been de facto replaced by a single asset across the US, which could be something which happens if we introduce a safe asset at European level, which might overcome the differentiation in lending rates to non-financial corporations, which we've had in Europe, and we showed one graph today. So the question is, do you think that it has an effect? It had an effect in the 1930s in terms of increasing correlations in business cycles, and second, whether this is something which might be replicated in Europe if we introduce a safe asset. Thanks.
So I think there is, in the increase in synchronization in 1930, so you have basically that the Great Depression is shared. So this is a shock that hits badly every region, right? So this is why in the first place the synchronization measure increases a lot, and then there's also a very strong recovery. And again, there is a very strong recovery in all regions. So I think what's more interesting is why then it doesn't further go down to the levels that were seen in the 1920s. In terms of the collateral used, I think this is very interesting, right? Because this is in fact the time when you get a huge increase in the issuance of federal government bonds. In terms of implementation of monetary policy, this is also the time where basically you no longer have liquidity provided through the discount window, but it's only through open market operations. So presumably, I think yes, you have this. I would expect this big change in the composition of the assets that are held by banks. There are also some other thing that fits with your story is that in the 1920s, in terms of regional shocks or how regions are affected by the Great Depression, you do see this doom loop that is taking place in certain regions more than in others, because banks have commercial paper or assets from the regions, and certain regions are more badly hit than others. So I haven't looked at the change in the composition in the balance sheet of commercial banks at around that time, but I think this is something to explore further.
So I don't have a huge amount to add, except that I want to be cautious about attributing too much to deposit insurance, if only because so many other things are happening at the same time. And of course, the big elephant in the room we haven't talked about is securities markets, which are really big in the US, right? And so, with the separation of commercial and investment banking, you have different kinds of institutions with different sort of political economy forces operating, right? And then this is just piggybacking a little bit on Jacob's story. So you have the Depression, you have the recovery, then you have the war, and you have massive regulatory changes all along. I mean, the alphabet soup would actually, for once, compete with Europe in that period. But then that also means you have adaptation and you have regulatory arbitrage, and sort of in the 50s, we're coming to terms with the fact that a lot of big institutions are actually gaming the system and getting around a lot of this compartmentalization, right? So there are a lot of things going on. So I think we want to be very careful about attributing it to any one factor. And then beyond that, even if it is the safety net, the question is how much harmonization do you get from federalizing the supervision as a result of the safety net, right? And that's something that I think we need to think about a little bit more.
Maybe just one sort of peripheral comment on that, picking up on what Anna said about the development of securities markets, which I think plays a huge role. And because I think it also partly may answer the question, obviously, that Anna posed in her presentation of what drives the decline in bank ownership of government debt. Well, again, to me, the answer is pretty clear. War. It's war effort. It's the Liberty Bond programs. Because what are the two periods during which, government bond issuance rose dramatically in the United States? Well, it's the two world wars. And how were they financed? Well, a lot of it was actually done through Liberty Bonds, which is essentially war bonds, which is essentially the selling of the war effort, based again on patriotism and a very concerted retail level effort, which I would certainly argue did a lot of things to familiarize average individuals and investors with bonds, setting up a security markets, which naturally therefore helped reduce the reliance of the broader financial system on banks, which of course is something that you haven't had in Europe.
Jeromin?
So maybe a point about that. So the way I think about sovereign holdings of banks is in a situation where you do not have well-developed secondary markets. It's about push, right? It's basically about the government pushing in these securities, and that's particularly relevant in war periods, right? Like Jacob just had. But then in periods with well-developed secondary markets, it's about pull. And so here the pull comes from sovereign risk. And so the notion is that when a sovereign starts looking shaky, the banks of that sovereign are a safer harbor for that debt than any other place. And the reason is that the sovereign is likely to either avoid defaulting because of the ramifications for the domestic payment system if the banking system were to go under, or if the sovereign defaults, the sovereign will recapitalize those banks. And so in that sense, banks have an incentive to buy this stuff because they're somewhat immune to sovereign defaults, assuming that the bank holdings are big enough. And so in addition to the point that that Jacob made about the wars, one thing which would be testable is whether the reduction of sovereign holdings in US banks have something to do with the combination of secondary markets developing, but particularly also sovereign risk just coming down, right? And so if you apply this to Europe, clearly this would be an alternative path. If we wait for another 30 years and everyone stays at their MTO, I'm convinced that naturally sovereign bond holdings in Italian banks will go down. The problem is we cannot afford another 30 years of financial fragility, but just keeping with this, the doom loop. That's why we need to accelerate this process, and that requires some sort of judicious combination of regulation and a safe asset.
Well, there I guess I would point out that one of the features of the Liberty Bond programs that were not removed or were actually transferred, initially under those programs, they were also tax exempt, which of course is a feature that today is still prevalent for state and local government bonds. So there's a tax preference, which I think it's fair to say that if you look at the stability of the municipal bond market in the US is quite useful for having a diversified investor base.
Okay, final question, José.
That we don't have 30 years to waste in Europe to do these kind of things, and in particular to deal with this doom loop. I would like to come back to what Anna said in her presentation, which struck me, that there is no sequencing, God-given sequencing to do these things. Now, we know that the system is so interconnected now and the cross-exposures are such that there is a sequencing. It's better to switch off the electricity before you start fiddling with the cables than do the electricity work with electricity on. And so that's why we put so much emphasis on the sequencing of these things in this report and saying, before you change the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt, you need to do a number of things before to switch off the electricity so that the system does not collapse. But that idea that there is no God-given sequencing struck me. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
So some of it is just completely descriptive, right? I I'm not enough of a historian to tell you about why we started with a political union and debt and why it took so long to get to federal income tax and geographic diversification, right? That I think is something that, but I agree with you entirely that at any given moment, sort of medium-term sequencing is all important. I think long-term sequencing is intractable, right? So I think that it's hard to, from 200 plus years of US banking development, it's really difficult to create a sequence that would be useful for the next 10 years of Europe. But you can pick out individual lessons like, if you don't have a fiscal union, if you don't have a monetary union, your banks are carrying an incredibly heavy load that is bound to lead to distortion. I want to interject, so this kind of ties in with the safe asset point. There's a really interesting paper that was actually written with Europe in mind about banking in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin in the 19th century, where so Indiana starts out doing really well. So the state defaults, but the state banks pay up at par, right? After the crisis of 1837. That's seen as incredibly impressive. And then everybody flocks into Indiana banks. And by the way, Indiana starts doing the free banking thing, right? And the markets can't tell the difference between the old legislatively chartered banking system with mutual liability and the free banks. So everybody kind of gets the influx. Meanwhile, the state sees this as a great opportunity to reduce its borrowing costs, and so starts requiring the new banks to buy bonds and doesn't haircut them. Meanwhile, Illinois and Wisconsin and some others automatically haircut even their own bonds. Right? And so as a result, Indiana banks do much, much worse the next time around in the 1850s, right? When they double down on their own debt and get these, sort of hot inflows. So we've struggled with these questions at the state level, and there's been regulatory response, but certainly lots of unintended consequences as well.
Okay, we've hit our witching hour. Mr. Truman, we've hit our witching hour.
I'm going to provide some. So I think at one point, the original Federal Reserve Act, this may answer, I think, I'm old enough to not remember everything I know, did not allow the Federal Reserve banks to buy U.S. debt, government debt, right? And that only came in the 1930s. Now, presumably, I think it was in the change, well, maybe it was more recent than that, but original Federal Reserve Act, they were not allowed to buy, this, if you want to go to it, this is, maybe something that's similar reasons for I don't know when it came in. I assume it was in the change in the Banking Act in the 1930s that they could start to buy federal debt. And on the question that Anna raised, Anna answered, it was all about New York.
Yeah, that's true.
So when they had the Federal Reserve Act, they said 8 to 12 districts. New York actually wanted to make all the districts be sub-districts of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Right? But they didn't get that. But the whole process, they kicked it over to a committee. The whole process involved how they designed the system, right? And the New York banks, the New York bankers, wanted them to basically all be subsidiaries of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the other districts, which was sort of, and then the New York Bank lost that battle.
But your first point is very important. You're saying the Fed startup was like the ECB startup. Can't buy sovereign debt.
That is my memory.
So then,
don't quite the source. Go back and look at the Federal Reserve Act, but that was my memory of it.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I want to thank our friends from the Commission again for sponsoring this, co-hosting with us, encouraging us to do all this work, which we have found fascinating and very important. We thank all of you for participating here today. I thank particularly this panel and I will declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
The